I was 37 when I decided to take some time off from everything. I had been working in logistics for over a decade, living in a small rented house on the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee. The days had started to blur together. Wake up, coffee, drive to the warehouse, check inventory, run schedules, answer emails. Repeat. I didn't hate my life, but it felt like something was slipping through my fingers. I hadn't done anything that made me feel alive in years. I needed something that would shake me up a little, something real. That's when I thought about hiking, not just walking on some paved trail behind a grocery store, but real hiking. The kind where you disappear for a few days, where your phone's useless, and where you carry everything on your back. I used to hike in my 20s. Nothing extreme, just trails in the Smokies, overnight stays, maybe 2 or 3 days out in the woods. I figured I could handle it again. I wasn't in peak shape, but I wasn't in bad shape either. I took a week off in early October, packed up my gear, bought a good GPS, and drove northeast into Virginia. I'd read about a network of lesser-used trails near the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests. Most people stuck to the Appalachian Trail or stayed near well-marked areas. But there was this one loop trail that a few bloggers mentioned, an old Forest Service route that twisted up along a mountain ridge and looped back through some dense woodland. It wasn't dangerous, just remote and hard to follow if you weren't paying attention. I printed a topographic map even though I had the GPS. I brought a backup compass and wrote out an itinerary that I left with a friend. I packed food for 4 days, a water filter, extra batteries, my first aid kit, and a decent tent. I planned on being back by the 4th day at the latest. The forecast was clear, high 60s in the day, low 40s at night. Perfect hiking weather. I parked my car near a gravel pull-off just outside of a tiny town called Paint Bank. There were no signs, just a small trail marker nailed into an old pine. I locked up, threw on my pack, and started walking. I remember feeling good that morning, calm and clear-headed. It was one of those early fall days where the sunlight still feels warm, but the air has that crisp edge that reminds you summer's over. The first day went by easy. The trail was narrow but clear, and it followed a dry creek bed for a few miles before rising into some rolling hills. I didn't see a single person. I passed under massive oaks and poplars, their leaves turning that deep amber color. The higher I climbed, the quieter everything got. Around late afternoon, I reached a saddle between 2 small peaks and found a good flat spot to set up camp. I cooked a freeze-dried meal, watched the sun dip behind the hills, and crawled into my tent. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day was when things started to shift. I woke up early and climbed higher into the ridge. The trail started fading a bit, not overgrown exactly, but less defined. There were a few faint markers here and there, ribbons tied to trees, small cairns, but they were inconsistent. I kept checking my GPS and compass. I wasn't lost, but I had to pay more attention. Around midday, I hit a part of the trail that cut along a steep drop on the west side of the ridge. There was no real danger, but I had to slow down and watch my footing. The wind had picked up, and the ridge was exposed. Nothing but low shrubs and dry grass for 100 yards in both directions. I remember stopping around 2 p.m. to eat some jerky and trail mix. I sat on a flat rock with a view of the valley below. It was beautiful, but the wind was constant, and it made everything feel a little uneasy. The sound of it rushing through the dried leaves and the grass made it hard to think. I pressed on, hoping to make it to the far side of the ridge before sunset. About an hour later, I reached a junction. My map showed a fork, a newer trail that curved down toward the forest, and the old service route that continued along the ridge. The ridge route was longer and rougher, but it looped back in a way that I thought would be more scenic. I figured I had the supplies and time. I stuck with the ridge. That was my mistake. The trail started to vanish completely in places. There were faint indentations in the ground, maybe from old boots or animals, but no markers. The wind got worse, and clouds started piling up in the distance. I checked my GPS again. It still showed I was roughly on track, though I had to backtrack a couple times to stay aligned. The sun dropped fast behind the ridge, and I realized I wasn't going to make it to the next campsite marked on my map. I found a semi-flat patch off the trail, nestled between some wind-bent fir trees. It wasn't ideal, but it was sheltered from the worst of the gusts. That night, I didn't sleep much. The wind howled all night, and I kept hearing things outside the tent. Branches creaking, leaves scraping, and once, something that sounded like soft footsteps. I told myself it was probably deer, maybe a fox. My flashlight didn't catch anything when I checked, but I kept my knife close, just in case. When I woke up the next morning, something felt off. I checked my GPS, it was dead. Just a blank screen. I swapped in new batteries. Nothing. Tried the backup set. Still nothing. I don't know if it got too cold, or if it took damage from all the bouncing around, but it was completely fried. That was the moment I realized how quiet everything was. The wind had stopped. No birds, no animals, just silence. I pulled out my compass and map and started trying to estimate where I was. I figured if I stayed on the ridge and kept heading southeast, I'd eventually loop back toward the junction or find one of the marked campsites. I packed up quickly and got moving, but the trail was almost gone now. I started seeing game trails and followed one I thought was correct, but it dropped me into a hollow that wasn't marked on my map. I climbed back up, bushwhacking through dense undergrowth and weaving around fallen trees. Hours passed. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds now, and I kept looking up, trying to guess the time. Then I slipped. I had stepped onto a patch of loose shale near a ledge. My boots slid out from under me, and I tumbled down about 20 feet, landing hard on my right side. My backpack absorbed some of it, but I felt a sharp pain shoot through my leg. I tried to stand and collapsed. My ankle was swollen and hot to the touch. I couldn't put weight on it. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the ground. I was alone, injured, and off trail with no GPS. I knew panic wouldn't help, so I forced myself to calm down. I wrapped the ankle with an elastic bandage and took some ibuprofen. I cut a walking stick from a dead branch and started hobbling toward what I hoped was downhill. That third night, I camped in a small clearing I found near a dry stream bed. I couldn't go far, and the pain was getting worse. I rationed my food, drank filtered water, and tried to stay warm. The cold settled in hard that night. My sleeping bag helped, but my ankle throbbed constantly. Every time I moved, the pain stabbed through me. The next morning, the weather turned. It started with light drizzle, then steady rain by mid-morning. The trail, or what was left of it, turned to mud. I kept slipping, trying to move forward. Every step felt like fire in my ankle. I was limping, soaked, exhausted. I dropped down into a ravine that wasn't on my map, thinking it might lead to a bigger stream or road. But it was just more forest, thick with underbrush and deadfall. I kept walking, hoping to see anything. An old trail sign, a cabin, even just tire tracks. Instead, I found a fence. It was rusted and bent, stretched across the edge of the woods. Beyond it was a long, narrow clearing filled with dead trees and brown grass. The air smelled faintly of rot, like something old had died nearby. I followed the fence for half a mile until I found a break, then pushed through and kept going. Around late afternoon, I saw something that made my chest tighten. An old trail marker, not new, not part of the network I had been following, but it was something wooden, cracked, and nailed to a leaning post. The letters were worn, but I could just make out FS21B. I recognized it from my printed map. It was an old fire service access trail that connected to a gravel road about 4 miles south. I almost cried. I forced myself to keep going, limping every step, drenched and filthy. I moved like a ghost through those woods, barely aware of anything except the path ahead. Felt endless, just trees and fog and pain. But then, around sundown, I saw it. The road, just a narrow stretch of gravel cutting through the trees, but it might as well have been gold. I stumbled onto it, dropped my pack, and sat there for a long time. Then I started walking. I must have walked another hour before I saw a cabin. Not a ranger station, just an old hunting shack, probably empty. But there was a faded orange pickup parked out front. I knocked on the door. A man opened it, wide-eyed, probably wondering what the hell I was doing there. He drove me to a small clinic in the next town over. They treated my ankle, said it was a bad sprain but no fracture. I stayed in a motel that night, I called my friend. I was 36 the year I decided to hike the backwoods stretch of Hollow Ridge in Tennessee. I'd been divorced for 3 years and had just quit my job as a warehouse manager in Louisville. I wasn't exactly spiraling, but I felt stuck. My life had become routine and gray, and I hadn't done anything risky or spontaneous in a long time. Hiking had always been something I loved, though I hadn't made time for it in over a decade. That summer, I thought maybe I could reconnect with that part of myself. Go into the woods for a few days and figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. I chose Hollow Ridge because it wasn't part of any major trail system and wasn't marked well on maps. It was more like a collection of old game trails, disused forestry roads, and broken paths locals had carved out over the years. I'd read about it once in an online forum where people traded stories of lesser-known hiking routes. Someone had posted a few blurry pictures and mentioned that it was quiet and underused. That was good enough for me. I started out early in the morning on a Thursday. I parked my truck behind an abandoned gas station about 10 miles from the trailhead. The heat had already settled in by then, thick and damp. I had a decent pack with supplies for 5 days: freeze-dried food, a portable water filter, 2 canteens, a small camping stove, a tarp, a sleeping bag, and a cheap but solid tent. I'd marked out a rough loop on a printed topographical map and planned to camp somewhere different each night, gradually circling back to my truck by Monday afternoon. The first day went smoothly. I moved slow and steady, not in a rush. The forest was dense, with towering sycamores and tulip poplars casting heavy shade across the floor. Vines looped across the trail in places, and there were plenty of spots where I had to duck under low branches or push through ferns. I passed a few old, rusted-out hunting blinds and even a crumbling stone foundation that looked like it belonged to a long-abandoned cabin. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. It was quiet. The only sounds were birds, insects, and the occasional creaking of trees swaying slightly in the breeze. By dusk, I made camp on a rise overlooking a small stream. I boiled some water, ate a bland pouch of pasta, and laid under the stars until I fell asleep. That night, it rained a little, but my tarp held up fine. The next day was more of the same, just quiet walking through deep woods. I didn't see a single person. Around mid-afternoon, I came across an old logging road that had been swallowed by the forest. It led up a narrow ridge, so I followed it for a while. At the top, I stopped for a break, leaned against a stump, and watched the fog roll in from the north. It was peaceful, felt like exactly what I needed. I think the trouble started on the third day, though I didn't recognize it as trouble right away. That morning, I hiked about 3 miles through denser terrain. I had to keep checking my map, and even then, I felt like I was slightly off course. The sun was out, but it filtered through the trees in a strange, hazy way that made it hard to track direction by light alone. Around noon, I found a shallow ravine that wasn't on my map, cut through the forest like a scar, about 10 feet deep and wide enough to walk through comfortably. I dropped into it, thinking it would make the hike easier since the brush along the banks was thinner. About 20 minutes later, I started seeing strange things. At first, it was just little stuff, odd, out-of-place junk that didn't make sense to find that deep in the woods. A rusted-out grocery cart tipped on its side, half buried in leaves. A tire swing still hanging from a high branch, though the tree around it had clearly grown wider since it was first tied there. A broken mirror leaning against a mossy log. I passed an old, child-sized shoe, cracked and moldy, sitting perfectly upright like someone had just stepped out of it. At first, I thought maybe I'd stumbled near the back edge of some forgotten property. I checked my map again, but the area I was in was all marked as state forest. No houses, no driveways, no roads within 5 miles in any direction. Still, I kept walking, thinking maybe the stuff had just washed down the ravine during storms. Then I came across the staircase. It was made of stone, maybe 10 steps total, built right into the bank of the ravine. The stones were large and uneven, but clearly shaped by human hands. Moss and dirt covered parts of it, but not as much as you'd expect for something that old. I stood at the bottom for a long while just looking at it. There was no structure above it, just more forest. No walls, No foundations, just a stairway that led to nothing. It was around then I realized I hadn't heard any birds in over an hour. The woods had gone quiet without me noticing. No chirping, no buzzing, just the sound of my own breath and the crunch of my boots. I felt an itch start up in the back of my mind. Not fear, not yet, but something like discomfort, like I'd wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I climbed up the steps anyway. I don't know why. Curiosity, I guess. At the top, there was nothing unusual, just more trees and brush. But something felt different. The air smelled faintly like metal. The light was weird too, kind of dim, even though the sun was still high. The woods ahead of me felt heavier, like they were pressing in tighter. I kept going, though my pace slowed. My stomach was tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped, the silence pressed harder. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was just spooked by that dumb staircase and the strange junk along the ravine. But that gnawing sense of being out of place only got worse. I set up camp that night in a little hollow surrounded by thick trees. The canopy was so dense I could barely see the stars. I didn't bother cooking anything hot. I just ate jerky and a granola bar and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. Every sound I heard, every cracking twig or rustling leaf, jerked me awake. I kept imagining things outside my tent. Footsteps, breathing. But when I'd sit up and listen, there was nothing. At one point in the night, I was sure I saw a faint light through the trees. It was distant, probably 50 yards off and flickering like a lantern. But it disappeared as soon as I focused on it. I thought maybe it was heat lightning or something reflecting off moisture in the air. I stayed awake for hours, clutching my knife under my sleeping bag. By morning, I was exhausted and sore. I packed up quickly and decided to backtrack. I'd had enough. Something about the area felt wrong, and I didn't want to push my luck any further. But that's when I realized I couldn't find the ravine again. I backtracked by the map, followed my own trail markers, but the terrain didn't match. The landmarks I remembered weren't where they should have been. Trees I swore I passed weren't there. I walked in circles for hours, but the staircase never appeared again. Neither did the mirror, the swing, or anything else. Just endless, repeating forest. Panic didn't hit all at once. It came slow, like a cold draft leaking into a warm room. I kept moving, kept checking the sun, kept drinking water in small sips. I told myself it was fine. I just needed to follow the slope of the land and I'd hit the stream I camped near on the first night. But the stream never came. By the fourth day, I was completely turned around. I'd stopped recognizing anything. I knew I should have stayed put, conserved energy, maybe tried making a signal. But something in me couldn't sit still. I felt watched all the time now, and the silence had grown unbearable. I hadn't seen a single animal in 2 days, not even bugs. That afternoon, I slipped on a loose slope and badly twisted my ankle. I hit the ground hard and rolled halfway down a hill, slamming my back into a log. Pain shot through my leg, sharp and immediate. Couldn't stand. I lay there for almost an hour, drenched in sweat, gritting my teeth. I tried to wrap the ankle with a spare shirt, then used a branch as a makeshift crutch. Every step was agony, but I kept going. By nightfall, I found an old shack tucked into a tight clearing. It looked like a trapper's hut, long abandoned. The roof was mostly collapsed, but 3 walls still stood. I crawled inside and collapsed. For the first time in days, I cried. Not loud, just soft, defeated sobs. I was hungry, lost, hurt, and scared in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I stayed in that shack all night, didn't sleep, just listened. I thought I heard something big moving around out there once, something with weight, but it didn't come close. When the sun rose, I crawled out and started dragging myself in a new direction. I no longer cared which way, I just wanted out. The 5th day, I came across a deer stand. It was rotting and half fallen, but it meant people had been here once. I searched around and found the remains of an old trail. Barely more than a game path, but it looked walked even recently. That was all I needed. I followed it. For hours I limped and hobbled along it, drinking the last of my water. My leg throbbed. My lips were cracked. I started seeing spots in my vision. But then, just before dusk, I saw something bright through the trees. Plastic. A blue... I was 32 the year I decided to solo hike the Black Ridge Trail in southern Utah. It was early October 2016. I had just quit my job in Denver, and I needed space to think, to reset. I'd always been into hiking, but this was my first real attempt at an extended solo trip. Black Ridge was quiet, off the radar for most people, and I figured the remoteness would give me exactly what I needed. The plan was to hike out 4 days, then loop back and return to my truck. I had mapped everything on paper and my phone, packed food for a week, brought a 3-liter water bladder, a water filter, a sleeping bag, and a lightweight tent. Everything I thought I'd need. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was about what could actually go wrong. Day 1 was uneventful. I parked at the trailhead around 7 a.m., strapped on my pack, and headed out. The air was cool, sky was clear. The trail wound through open desert for the first few miles. Low shrubs, packed sand, red rock outcrops in the distance. I passed a few signs but saw no other hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. I followed the ridgeline west, climbing slightly over time, then dipping into a narrow canyon that stayed shaded most of the afternoon. That first night, I pitched my tent near a dry creek bed. I read for a while and fell asleep easily. The second day, I started climbing. The trail here was less marked, just a mix of footprints and bike tracks. I kept checking my map and GPS, and everything seemed right. The landscape changed, more boulders, fewer trees. I reached a spot I'd marked called Raven's Pass, a narrow strip of land between 2 steep rock walls, barely wide enough to walk. The wind funneled through it constantly, like it was being squeezed. I kept moving and made decent time, covering about 12 miles by dusk. I camped near a flat rock ledge and cooked some rice and tuna over my little stove. The third day was when things started to shift. I woke up to find that one of the plastic straps on my backpack had broken during the night. I rigged it up with paracord and kept moving, but it was annoying. By late morning, I hit a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. There were no signs, no markers. The left path dipped into a dense thicket of scrub oak and shadows. The right looked more like what I'd been following, packed earth and occasional stone piles marking the way. I took the right path. I figured it had to be the main trail. I walked for hours that day, but something felt off. I wasn't gaining elevation anymore, even though I should have been climbing toward the rim. The terrain didn't match my map. I didn't see any of the markers I was expecting. Around 4 p.m., I checked my phone GPS, and it kept glitching. 1 second it showed me on trail, the next it had me a mile off course. I chalked it up to the steep rock walls interfering with signal and kept going. I assumed I'd reconnect with the main trail eventually. That night, I set up camp in a dry ravine surrounded by sharp, narrow cliffs. The wind howled all night. At one point, I thought I heard something move near my tent, probably a jackrabbit or maybe a fox, but it set me on edge. I didn't sleep well. My mind was turning over small details. How the trail had forked unexpectedly, how my GPS couldn't keep up, how I hadn't seen a single person in 3 days. That had been a comfort at first, but now it felt like something else. The fourth morning, I was certain I was off trail. I hiked for 2 hours before admitting it to myself. I pulled out my paper map and tried to triangulate based on landmarks, but the problem was I couldn't find anything that matched. No named ridges, no rock formations I recognized. Everything just looked the same, red and tan rock, scattered brush, dry gullies. Around midday, I made the decision to backtrack. I thought I could reach that fork again, maybe figure out where I went wrong, but I couldn't find it. Every bend looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I started second-guessing every turn. I stopped twice to rest and filter water from small muddy pools, but the water tasted metallic and left my mouth dry. I rationed my snacks, trail mix, and dried fruit. By evening, I knew I was completely turned around. I tried climbing a tall outcrop to get a better view, and from the top I could see only endless rock and brush stretching in all directions. No signs of life, no paths, no hikers, not even birds. I camped that night without a fire, even though the cold started to seep in hard. My sleeping bag wasn't built for below freezing temps, and the desert drops fast after dark. I shivered for hours. I kept waking up thinking I heard things moving outside. I gripped the handle of my knife even though I knew how useless it would be. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself people get lost and people get found. Day 5, I got up sore, cold, and hungry. I had maybe 2 more days of food left if I rationed tight. Water was worse. I hadn't seen a real stream in 2 days, just shallow puddles and thick muddy patches. I started moving west. I didn't know for sure if it was west, but the sun was behind me and I knew the trailhead was generally east, so it was the best logic I had. That day was long. I climbed in and out of gullies, tripped over loose rocks, scraped my hands trying to steady myself on ledges. My boots were starting to separate at the seams. My right ankle ached from a twist I got stepping into a hole I hadn't seen. But I kept moving. The fear kept me upright. The fear of stopping, of letting night catch me again in a place I didn't recognize, where no one knew where I was. That night, I found a small alcove beneath a rock shelf. I didn't even set up the tent. I curled inside my sleeping bag and lay still. I had nothing left to think about. I didn't even bother with food. My stomach had started to feel tight and sour anyway. I sucked on a piece of gum just to keep my mouth wet. On day 6, something in me broke. I remember walking until my legs gave out. I dropped to my knees in a clearing surrounded by sharp rocks and just sat there. I looked around and realized I didn't know what direction I'd come from. My tracks were everywhere, circling like a dog chasing its tail. I thought about staying there and just letting things happen. I imagined what it would feel like to be still and let the desert take me. But then I remembered my sister. Her kid had a birthday coming up. I had promised to visit. That tiny thing, that small promise, was enough to get me moving again. I stood up, adjusted my pack, and picked a direction. I told myself I'd follow it until sunset, no matter what. Late that afternoon, I found the remains of an old trail sign. It was half buried in sand and broken in half, but I recognized the name. Willow Crest. I remembered marking it on my original map. That meant I wasn't far from the main loop. My hands started shaking when I saw it. Real movement, real proof I wasn't completely lost. I followed that direction for another 3 miles and found the trail. Not just a trail, but the trail. Wide, worn, and marked. Could have cried. I dropped my pack and sat there for 20 minutes just letting the sun warm my face. That night, I set up my tent on solid, flat ground. I boiled the last of my rice and ate slowly. I drank almost all of my water and didn't care. I knew I was less than a day from the trailhead. On day 7, I walked steady. No rush, but no stopping. I saw a snake sunning itself on a rock, the first sign of life I'd seen in days. Then a hawk flying overhead. Then boot prints. Fresh, not mine. I reached the parking lot a little after 2 p.m. My truck was there, covered in dust but untouched. I climbed inside, turned on the engine, and let the air blow hot across my face. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there, breathing. It took a few weeks for me to admit to anyone how lost I'd gotten. I kept saying things like, I took a longer route, or I got turned around. But inside, I knew how close I'd come to real danger. I wasn't prepared. Not for that kind of isolation. Not for the quiet way fear creeps in when no one's coming and you don't know the way out. Since then, I still hike. But I don't go solo anymore. I double-check every trail. I leave a copy of my route with 2 people. I pack extra food. I bring a compass. I learned the hard way that nature doesn't care about your schedule or your feelings. It will keep going long after you're gone. But I made it back. That's what matters. I made it out. And now I know I'll never forget that silence. That feeling of being so far from everything you've ever known and somehow still finding your way back. It was early in the morning, a chill in the air that only those who wake before the world truly does can understand. I had always preferred the solitude of hiking at dawn. The forest was quieter, more still, and the day's first light trickled through the canopy in a way that made everything feel peaceful. I was 27 years old and had been hiking for years. My usual trails were well-worn, the paths familiar, but today I had decided to try something new. A friend had recommended this particular route, a less-traveled trail deep in the woods. The type of place most people wouldn't dare go without a guide. They mentioned something about a ravine, a waterfall hidden behind thick trees, but I wasn't worried. I've hiked alone before, and I've always been careful. My bag was light, just the essentials: water, a map, some snacks, and my trusty first aid kit. The last thing I wanted was to make a rookie mistake by overloading myself. The weather had been dry for days, and although it was early fall, the leaves hadn't started their descent into the color change yet. It was still mostly green, the thick canopy above me filtering the sun as I made my way along the narrow, winding trail. The first hour or so was nothing remarkable. A few bird calls, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional chirp of a distant insect. There was a slight incline, but nothing too strenuous. I'd hiked more difficult terrain. This was a warm-up, but as I went deeper into the forest, the trail began to get a bit trickier. The ground became more uneven, the path less defined, and soon, I was pushing through thickets of brambles and low-hanging branches. The quiet, though, was what caught my attention. It was almost too quiet, no more birds, no squirrels darting about. The usual forest sounds seemed to have disappeared. That's when I noticed it. Faint smell, like something rotting. It was subtle at first, just a waft on the breeze. But as I walked further, it grew stronger. It was the kind of scent that made your stomach turn, like something had been decaying for far too long. I stopped for a moment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I looked around, but all I saw were trees, some of them knotted and twisted, the underbrush thick with ferns and fallen leaves. I shrugged it off. Nature can smell bad sometimes. I smelled worse, but that smell lingered, following me as I walked. After another half hour of steady progress, I finally reached the edge of the ravine. It was impressive, more so than I expected. A narrow canyon split the earth, running deep into the ground, and at the far end, a waterfall cascaded down in a frothy rush of white water. The sound of the waterfall was deafening, echoing off the steep, rocky walls of the ravine. I took a deep breath, the air cool and crisp now, and made my way along the edge, looking for a safe way down to the water. I found a rough path leading down the side of the ravine, a series of crumbled rocks and moss-covered roots acting as a natural stairway. It was steep but manageable. I was careful, making sure to keep my footing solid as I descended. The smell was still there, lingering in the air, but now I was distracted by the sight of the water below. It wasn't exactly a lake or a pond, but rather a small, fast-moving stream that wound its way through the ravine before disappearing into the dense woods beyond. I reached the bottom of the ravine, wiping my hands on my pants as I steadied myself. The smell hit me again, stronger now, and I gagged. There had to be something dead nearby. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of finding whatever it was, but the waterfall was beautiful, and I wasn't about to let a little stench ruin the moment. The closer I got to the water, though, the more something started to feel off. The ground was wetter here, the mud slick and uneven, and the rocks I had been using as stepping stones were covered in algae. I could barely see the bottom of the stream through the murky water, but there was something about the way the place looked, untouched, as though no one had been there for years. The trees seemed older, their trunks gnarled and twisted in strange, unnatural ways. I felt an uneasy chill crawl down my spine, but I shook it off, chalking it up to the growing unease from the smell. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor, but then it happened again, stronger this time, enough to make me stop in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. I could hear the water rushing below me, the wind whispering through the trees, but there was something else now, something heavier, like the forest itself was shifting. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, the kind that makes you question if you're truly alone out here. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from the water to the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. No movement, No shadows, nothing. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned around, looking back up at the ravine's edge. The path I'd come down was still visible, but I couldn't help but feel that the trail was more difficult to follow now, the rocks appearing almost unfamiliar, as though they had shifted in the brief time I had been here. The unease grew, gnawing at me like a persistent itch in the back of my mind. I took a few hesitant steps toward the edge of the water, hoping to find some comfort in the beauty of the place. But the smell was getting worse, so much so that I had to cover my nose with the sleeve of my jacket. The air felt thick now, oppressive, and I felt a deep, primal need to get out of there, to turn around and leave this place behind. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a faint, dark shape beneath the water, a shadow barely noticeable. But as I watched, the shape began to move. Slowly, almost deliberately, my heart began to race, but I couldn't look away. The shape moved closer to the surface, rising as if it were being pulled up from the depths of the water. And then, for just a brief moment, I saw what it was. A body, half submerged, its clothes tattered and torn, the skin pale and bloated. A man. His eyes were open, glassy, and staring straight at me, and his mouth hung open, as if in a permanent scream. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The horror of the sight took a moment to sink in, but when it did, my instinct was clear. Get out. Get out fast. I spun on my heel, scrambling back up the ravine as quickly as my legs could carry me. But the rocks were slick, the path more treacherous than before. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was resisting my attempts to leave. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. By the time I reached the top of the ravine, I was panting, my chest heaving with exertion and fear. I glanced over my shoulder once more, but there was nothing behind me, just the trees. The smell was fading, but the image of that body, those empty eyes, would stay with me for much longer. I made my way back to the main trail, my legs shaking, my mind racing. When I finally reached the parking area, I was met with the familiar, comforting sight of my car. I didn't waste any time. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove away, not daring to look back. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just escaping the ravine, but something else, something that had followed me out of the woods. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I didn't stop, couldn't. Eventually, I made it home. I locked every door, closed all the windows, and sat in silence for what felt like hours. But no matter how much I tried to shake it, the fear lingered. I never went back to that ravine, never even told anyone what I saw. I didn't want anyone to know, but I'll never forget that feeling. The way it felt like the forest didn't want me to leave. How the air seemed to thicken, like it was holding something back. Something that, for whatever reason, didn't want to be disturbed. And that body, it was the one thing I couldn't shake. The one thing I knew for certain. There was something deeply wrong with that place, and maybe the forest was trying to warn me all along. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the Sierra Madre Mountains in northern Mexico. It was the spring of 2017, early April. I had been living in Texas for the last 5 years and had done a lot of hiking around the southern parts of the US, but I wanted something different. Something off the beaten path. I'd heard from a guy I used to work with that the Sierra Madre Occidental Range had some of the most untouched trails in North America. He said it was quiet, isolated, and beautiful. That's exactly what I wanted. I spent about 2 weeks planning. I wasn't reckless. I bought new maps, marked routes, downloaded GPS tracks onto my handheld device, and packed all the gear I thought I'd need. My plan was to hike for 5 days, starting near a small town called Creel and heading southwest into the deeper parts of the mountains. I'd camp at night and be careful about water sources. I packed a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove for freeze-dried meals per day, iodine tablets, a filtration pump, and a spare battery pack for my GPS and flashlight. I also carried a compact pistol, just in case I ran into any trouble. That wasn't really something I ever needed before, but I'd heard stories about cartel activity in the region, and it made me uneasy. I didn't tell too many people I was going, mostly because I didn't know many people well. I emailed my older brother, who lived in Seattle, with a rough route and dates. I figured I'd message him again when I got back. The first day of hiking was smooth. I parked my rented SUV just outside Creel and locked everything inside. I hiked for around 6 hours before setting up camp. The air was thin but clean, and the smell of pine was strong in the breeze. I didn't see another person all day. That was the kind of solitude I was looking for. The terrain was a mix of rocky trails, dense trees, and open ridgelines. Some paths were marked, but most of the time I followed animal tracks and barely visible trails. The night was cold, but I was warm in my sleeping bag. I heard distant howls that night, probably coyotes, but nothing close enough to worry me. The second day took me deeper into the mountains. The sun rose early, and I made good progress, even though the trails were rough. I came across some signs of old campsites, scattered fire pits, rusted cans, broken sticks arranged unnaturally, but nothing recent. I didn't think much of it. By noon, I was walking along the edge of a high ridge that dropped into a narrow valley. The view was incredible, just endless waves of forest-covered mountains rolling into the horizon. About an hour later, I slipped while trying to cross a patch of loose rock. I didn't fall hard, but I twisted my left ankle a little. I stopped and sat down, unlaced my boot, and checked for swelling. It didn't seem serious, just sore. I wrapped it with some cloth and tightened my boot back up. It slowed me down a little, but I kept going. I had already planned on camping near a stream I saw on the map, and I didn't want to be walking at night. That night, I camped beside that stream. It was narrow and cold, but clean. I refilled my bottles, cooked a warm meal, and lay back listening to the water run. But something about that night felt different. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I heard soft movements outside my tent, like twigs snapping. I got up twice to check, shining my flashlight into the woods. Nothing. No eyes reflecting, no shapes, no sound when I stepped outside. Just silence. The kind that wraps around you and makes everything louder in your own head. On the third day, things started to feel off. I was deep into the backcountry, far past the last known trail. My GPS was still working fine, but I noticed something strange. My route was leading through a narrow gorge I didn't remember marking. I checked my map again. It was there, but I must have misjudged the slope. The walls were steep and the shadows deep. I didn't like it, but I didn't have much choice. The gorge was the fastest way to cross to the next ridge without doubling back. The gorge was tight. The air felt cooler, and the light barely came through the tops of the cliffs. I walked for about an hour through there, constantly watching the walls, feeling like I was being funneled into something. At one point, I found an old boot stuck between two rocks. It was torn, and the sole was missing. It looked like it had been there for years, sun-bleached and worn. That's when I realized this area might have been used by other people, not hikers, though. Probably smugglers or people crossing illegally. That thought made my stomach knot. Halfway through the gorge, I smelled something. At first, I thought it was a dead animal, but it was different, sharper, more like decay mixed with smoke. I stopped and looked around but saw nothing. I didn't want to stay there. I sped up, even though my ankle was starting to throb. The smell faded after a while, but it left me unsettled. I made it out of the gorge just before sunset and camped at a flat area on the ridge. The wind was stronger up high, but it felt safer than the dark canyon. Still, I kept waking up through the night. Once, I sat straight up thinking I heard footsteps. Not animals, steady, rhythmic, like someone trying to be quiet. I unzipped the tent and stared out for a long time. There was no moon, just stars and black trees swaying. Nothing moved. I laid back down but kept my hand on the pistol inside my bag. The fourth day started rough. My ankle had stiffened overnight, and I had to limp through the first few miles. I checked my GPS and realized I was a full day behind schedule because of the terrain and my slow pace. I only had 2 more days of food left. I didn't like being behind, but I figured if I pushed through, I could still make it back by the 5th day. Then, late that morning, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There were footprints. Not mine, these were fresher. I spotted them along a dusty, dry patch of trail. They looked like boots. I checked around to be sure I wasn't seeing things. They were definitely there, and they were heading in the same direction I was. The trail was too narrow to go around. I didn't want to follow someone I didn't know, especially in a place like this, but I didn't have a better option. I moved slower after that, constantly checking my surroundings. The trail led through more dense woods, with no signs of movement, but the feeling wouldn't go away, like I was being watched. Every gust of wind or snap of a branch had me gripping the strap of my pack tight. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing with the remains of an old hunting cabin. Just the frame, really, walls rotted through, roof half gone. I checked it out quickly, looking for any signs of life. I didn't find any, but I noticed something strange. A fire pit with ashes that looked recent. Not warm anymore, but not gray and scattered like old ones either. Someone had been there, probably within the last day or two. That bothered me more than I expected. I didn't camp there. I moved another mile west and found a slope with some rock overhangs. It wasn't comfortable, but I didn't want to be too exposed. That night was the worst. I barely slept. I kept thinking about the footsteps, the fire, and the smell in that gorge. I couldn't shake the thought that someone else was out there, and they didn't want to be found. The final day, I pushed hard. I was limping worse now, and my food was down to 2 bars and a bag of trail mix. I skipped breakfast to ration it. I checked the GPS constantly, willing the miles to go faster. Around noon, I heard something ahead, twigs snapping, like before. I froze behind a tree and waited. After a few minutes, I heard it again, but closer. It was too slow and heavy for a deer. Then I saw something move between the trees, just a flash of dark fabric. I didn't stick around. I took a side trail to the north that curved around the ridge. I walked until my legs ached and then walked more. I only stopped to drink and check the GPS. By late afternoon, I recognized the area. I was less than 4 miles from where I'd parked. Relief started to creep in, but I didn't relax yet. Just before dusk, I made it to the dirt road where I'd started. My SUV was still there, dusty but untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. My hands were shaking. I didn't realize how tense I'd been until I finally stopped moving. I didn't see anyone on the drive back into Creel. I refueled, paid cash at the station, and got a room in a small inn for the night. I slept for 12 hours straight. The next morning, I called my brother and told him I was heading back to Texas. I didn't tell him everything, just that the trail was harder than I thought. It's been years since that trip. I still hike, but I stay close to home now. No more remote places, no solo trips. I learned that just because a place is quiet and beautiful doesn't mean it's safe. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to. I made it out. That's all that matters. And now, whenever someone tells me they're planning a solo hike far out where no one goes, I tell them the truth. Don't. Not unless you're ready for what you might find out there. The sun had just dipped behind the mountain peaks as I tied my boots and adjusted the straps of my backpack. The trail ahead was barely visible in the fading light, but I'd been here enough times to know the path well. I'd hiked the same route a dozen times, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was because of the weather. Thick clouds were rolling in, casting a strange kind of stillness over the landscape. I shrugged it off, focusing on my steps. I wasn't planning on going far. Just a quick solo hike up to the ridge to catch the last few moments of daylight. It was peaceful up there. No other hikers, just the sounds of the wind in the trees and the distant rumble of water flowing down the mountain. A small escape from the daily grind. At least that's what I told myself as I started the climb. The first part of the trail was familiar enough, a well-worn path through dense trees. The ground was soft underfoot, damp from the rain that had come through earlier in the day. My breath came in steady puffs as I made my way uphill, the air growing cooler as I ascended. The sound of birds chirping had faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I kept my pace steady, trying not to rush, but I couldn't shake the odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was nothing I could put my finger on, just an instinct that had started gnawing at me. Still, I pressed on, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It had been a long day at work, and a little solo time on the mountain was just what I needed to clear my head. The trail grew steeper as I continued upward, the trees thinning out as the terrain opened up. I reached a small clearing where the path split. One branch veered off to the right, leading to a section of the trail I'd never explored. Normally, I would have kept to the familiar route, but tonight something made me curious. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was just the need to see something new. I took the right-hand path. As I walked along the new trail, the air grew colder. The wind picked up, pushing through the trees with a low, eerie howl. The clouds overhead had darkened even more, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of the impending storm. I was too far along to turn back now, so I kept moving forward. The trail narrowed, and soon I found myself navigating between thick bushes and low-hanging branches. I had to crouch at times to avoid getting snagged by the brambles. The ground was uneven, and I had to step carefully to avoid tripping over rocks and roots. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife, no tracks or sounds, just the rustling of the trees. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance. It was too small to be a campfire, but it flickered like one, hidden just beyond a bend in the trail. I stopped, my curiosity piqued. I hadn't expected to encounter anyone up here, especially this late in the day. I moved closer, keeping to the shadows. As I rounded the bend, the light grew clearer. It was coming from a small, dilapidated cabin tucked into the side of the mountain. The structure was barely standing. Wooden planks had fallen away, and the windows were shattered. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. There was no reason for anyone to be up here, not this far from the main trail. The cabin had been abandoned for years, from what I'd heard. It wasn't the kind of place hikers or campers would stay in. Felt wrong. But the light, there was something about it that drew me in. I approached cautiously, keeping my distance. The last thing I wanted was to disturb someone who might be up there. As I got closer, I could see that the light was coming from a small lantern, sitting on a table just inside the door. But there was no sign of movement inside. No voices, no footsteps. I stepped closer to the door, hesitating for a moment before deciding to peek inside. The smell of old wood and decay hit me immediately. The cabin was in worse shape than I had imagined. A broken chair lay on its side, and the remnants of a fire pit were scattered across the floor. But what struck me the most was the feeling of emptiness. It was as if the cabin hadn't just been abandoned, it had been forgotten, left to rot. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. A piece of paper, half hidden under a pile of old firewood, caught my eye. I knelt down and reached for it, brushing away the debris to reveal a worn, yellowed sheet. I unfolded it carefully, trying not to tear it. It was a map. The ink was faded, but the drawing was clear enough. A rough sketch of the surrounding area, with several marked trails and landmarks. But there was one trail that stood out, marked with an X, as if it were something important. It led deeper into the forest, far off the beaten path. The further I looked at it, the more uneasy I became. I had never heard of this trail, nor had I ever seen it on any of the maps I had used for hiking. A chill ran down my spine. I stuffed the map into my backpack and took one last look around the cabin before heading back toward the main trail. But just as I turned to leave, I heard something soft, almost imperceptible at first. A faint rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. My head snapped toward the sound. Nothing. I waited, straining my ears, but the rustling had stopped. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I had to get out of here, fast. I retraced my steps, moving quickly but quietly, trying not to panic. The trail seemed longer than it had before, and every snap of a twig or gust of wind made my heart race. The trees felt denser now, the shadows darker. It was as if the forest was closing in around me. I reached the fork in the trail, the one I had passed earlier. My legs were aching from the climb, but I knew I couldn't keep going in the direction I had been heading. I decided to take the main path back down. But when I turned to retrace my steps, I froze. The trail wasn't the same. The path that had once been clear and familiar now seemed to twist and wind in unexpected directions. I had taken a wrong turn. I was lost. My breath caught in my throat as panic set in. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had hiked these woods countless times. I should be able to find my way out. But the trees had become unfamiliar, and the sounds of the forest seemed wrong. Too quiet, too still. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. The battery was almost dead. Anyway, I was on my own with nothing but the map I had found in that cabin. I sat down on a rock, trying to collect my thoughts. I couldn't afford to lose my head. I needed to think. My mind raced as I recalled the map, the one with the marked trail. There had to be something there that could help me. Maybe it was a shortcut. Maybe it was the way out. I decided to head in the direction the map had indicated, the trail marked with the X. The thought of being deeper in the woods wasn't comforting, but I didn't have much of a choice. I followed the map as best I could, trying to make sense of the landmarks. It was slow going. The path was rough and overgrown, the trees thick with moss and ivy. But after what felt like hours, I saw it. A small clearing, and beyond that, a river. I knew this area. This was where the trail would connect back to the main path. Relief flooded over me, but I didn't let my guard down. I still had to make it back to the main trail, and I wasn't out of the woods yet. Literally, I followed the river, knowing it would lead me in the right direction. As the light finally began to fade, I spotted the familiar outline of the main trail in the distance. My heart surged with hope. I had made it. The hike back down was uneventful. The storm that had been threatening earlier never arrived. When I finally reached the parking lot, I collapsed onto the hood of my car, exhausted but relieved. It was only then that I remembered the map. I pulled it out of my bag and stared at it, tracing the line of the X with my finger. There was something about it, a feeling, a sensation I couldn't shake. I didn't know what I had stumbled across that day, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be returning to that cabin. The forest had its secrets, and some things were better left undiscovered. I drove home that evening, grateful for the safety of my own bed and the quiet comfort of my own home. And though the memory of the strange cabin and the mysterious map lingered in my mind, I knew that I had made it out. I wasn't lost anymore. I was 34 that summer, living in a small rental just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd moved there a couple years before from New Mexico, looking for a quieter life. I worked from home most days, doing contract design work, and I didn't have many friends nearby. My routine was boring: wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. When you're alone that much, your mind starts to wander. I spent a lot of time reading, watching survival shows, looking at trail maps. I'd always been into hiking, but I'd only done day hikes. I was careful about it. I read stories about people who got lost or hurt, and I never wanted to be one of them. That summer had been especially hot, but by mid-September, things were finally cooling down. I'd been feeling restless. I hadn't taken a real break in months, and the idea of doing a multi-day solo hike started to grow in my head. I'd never done one before. I figured it would give me space to think, to reset, and to get out of my own head for a while. I wanted to test myself too. I wanted to see if I could handle being alone out there, far from everything, no one to help me if something went wrong. I picked a place called Kendrick Peak Wilderness. It's not far from Flagstaff, but far enough to feel isolated. There are longer trails that loop through the hills, and I found a 3-day route online that looked good. It started at a lower elevation and wound its way through a stretch of forest and old lava fields. I planned to hike in about 10 miles the first day, set up camp, then do another 10 or so the next day, loop around and make my way back out on the third day. I spent a week prepping. I made a checklist: tent, sleeping bag, extra socks, food, water filter, bear spray, basic medical kit, map, compass, headlamp, backup batteries, lighter, small knife, emergency whistle. I packed enough dehydrated meals and protein bars to last 5 days, just in case. I charged everything. I left my route and return date with one of the few friends I had in town, told them if I wasn't back by Sunday night, to call someone. I thought I was being smart, careful, prepared. I left early on a Thursday morning. The drive out was quiet. Sun just coming up, sky that pale pink that turns gold as the morning goes on. I pulled up to the trailhead around 6:45 a.m., parked, double-checked everything, locked up the car. It was cool enough for a jacket. The air smelled like pine and dry dirt. I was nervous but excited. I took a photo of the map at the trailhead, checked the printed copy in my pack, and started walking. The first couple of miles were beautiful. The trail started in dense forest, tall pines, fallen logs, birds chirping. I passed one other hiker heading the opposite way. We nodded but didn't speak. After that, I didn't see anyone else. Felt peaceful. I stopped a few times to rest and drink water, and by early afternoon, I'd reached a flat area just off the trail that looked like a perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent near a rocky outcrop, about 20 feet from a small creek. There were signs of previous campers, ashes from an old fire ring, flattened spots where tents had been. I filtered some water, made a small meal, and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. The place was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no bugs. Even the birds were mostly silent. But I didn't think much of it at the time. That night was fine. I sat in the dark with my headlamp off, just listening. The stars were out in full, and the sky was so clear it looked fake. I thought, this is exactly what I needed. I went to bed early, slept in intervals, woke up a few times to drink water or shift in my sleeping bag, but nothing unusual. The next morning, I packed up and continued along the trail. The terrain got rougher. Parts of the trail were overgrown, and I had to slow down a lot to avoid tripping or walking into branches. I was about 12 miles from the trailhead at that point, more than a day's walk out. Around mid-afternoon, something started to feel off. I don't know how else to say it. The air felt heavier. The trail was harder to follow. The ground had changed to less dirt, more loose rock. My feet were getting sore from the uneven terrain. I checked my map 3 times in the span of an hour, even though the trail was still technically visible. By the time I found a spot to camp that night, I was exhausted. My legs hurt, my back was tight from carrying the pack, and I'd developed a dull headache. The place I stopped was less ideal than the night before. It was farther from water, and the trees were spaced farther apart. No sign of previous camps, no fire ring. I set up quickly, ate in silence, and crawled into my tent before sunset. That night was the turning point. I heard something outside around 2 a.m. It was faint, something moving slowly through the trees. I sat up and held my breath. First, I thought it was wind. Then I realized the air was still. No breeze at all. The sound was deliberate, steady, like footsteps on dry leaves, but spaced too far apart to be small. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen in my sleeping bag, listening. It went on for maybe 15 minutes, then silence again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped outside and checked around my tent. Nothing. No prints. No disturbed earth. But I knew what I'd heard. I considered heading back the way I came, but that would have taken me longer. The loop was meant to curve back toward the trailhead, so I kept going, hoping I just imagined it. But things got worse. About 2 hours into the hike that morning, I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. The trail had split without warning, and I'd followed the wrong path for maybe 30 minutes before I noticed. I backtracked, but it shook me. I started doubting myself, second-guessing every step. I stopped using the map and just started following what looked most like a path. Then I ran into a dead end. The trail just ended, faded into brush and rocks. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. The sun was getting low, and I didn't know where I was anymore. I checked my GPS, but there was no signal. My map didn't help because I couldn't tell where I'd gotten lost. Panicked, my heart started racing, and I felt this heat rise up in my chest. I knew I wasn't dying or anything, but I felt trapped. I dropped my pack, sat down, and forced myself to breathe. It took a long time for me to calm down. I found a clearing about 100 yards from where I'd stopped and set up camp. I barely ate that night. My stomach felt sick. I kept thinking about those footsteps I'd heard the night before. I knew there were mountain lions and bears in the area. What if I was being followed? I barely slept again. I kept my knife close, though I knew it wouldn't help much against something big. Every little sound outside made my heart jump. By morning, I was mentally done. I didn't care about finishing the loop. I just wanted to find my way out. I decided to go east, hoping I'd intersect with the trail again. I used the sun to guide me. I marked trees as I went in case I had to backtrack. Around midday, I found a dry creek bed. I followed it for a while, thinking it might lead to something. It was rough terrain, full of sharp rocks and fallen branches. I slipped twice. On the second fall, I landed hard on my side and tore a hole in my pants. My hip took the worst of it, and walking after that hurt like hell. I kept going slower now, limping slightly. I rationed my water. I was sweating more and drinking less. I kept checking behind me, convinced I'd hear something again, but it was quiet. Late that afternoon, I saw something in the distance that made my knees go weak. A trail marker. It was faded, nearly hidden behind a fallen tree, but it was there. I scrambled toward it and almost cried when I saw the small plastic square nailed to the tree beside it with an arrow pointing north. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I knew I wasn't completely lost anymore. I followed that marker for 2 more hours, up a slow incline through the trees. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop for anything. I was running on adrenaline. Eventually, I came to a clearing and saw something through the trees. Cars. Parking lot. Not mine, but a parking lot. I'd come out at a different trailhead, about 10 miles from where I'd started. There were 2 cars parked there, both empty. I checked for cell service. 1 bar. I texted my friend and dropped a pin. They came and got me 2 hours later. I lost 12 pounds on that trip. My hip took weeks to heal. I didn't hike again for a long time after that. I never figured out what I heard that night in the woods. Could have been an animal. Could have been something else. I don't know. But I do know how fast things can go from peaceful to dangerous out there. I was lucky. I got out. A few wrong steps and I could have ended up like the people I used to read about in those lost hiker stories. Now, when people ask if I'd ever hike alone again, I tell them the truth. No, not like that. Not ever again. I woke up early on a crisp Saturday morning in late October, the air sharp and cool against my face as I pulled myself out of bed. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the first light was barely creeping over the horizon. I was excited. It had been months since I had been on a good hike. My last one had been back in June, and life had gotten in the way since then. Work, family, and other distractions had kept me indoors for too long. Today, I was determined to change that. I grabbed a quick breakfast, just some coffee and toast. Nothing fancy, but enough to get me going. I packed my gear into the old hiking backpack I had inherited from my uncle. It was worn and had seen better days, but it held up well, and it was comfortable. My boots were laced tight, and I was ready. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not that I thought I needed to, but it was one of those solo trips where I just wanted to escape, even if only for a day. The plan was simple. Drive up to the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, park at the trailhead, and follow a trail I had read about. It wasn't a popular one, and that was just how I liked it. I didn't want to be surrounded by crowds of other hikers. I wanted peace. The map I had printed out the night before showed a path that snaked through dense forest, crossed a creek, and ended up at a scenic overlook. It seemed perfect. I threw my gear in the back of my old truck, a 2007 Toyota Tacoma, and started the drive. The road was quiet this early, the only sound coming from the tires humming against the asphalt. As I made my way out of town and into the more rural parts of the area, I felt the tension from the week start to melt away. There's something about being alone on the road, away from the constant buzz of phone notifications, meetings, and the demands of everyday life, that makes everything feel simpler. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had fully risen, and the sky was that soft, pale blue that comes with a crisp autumn morning. The trees surrounding the trail were in full color, their leaves a brilliant mix of reds, oranges, and yellows. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air, and then grabbed my pack and headed down the trail. The first mile or so was easy. The path was well maintained, though it quickly narrowed as it entered the woods. I found myself stepping over roots and pushing through low-hanging branches. I didn't mind. There's something peaceful about walking alone in the forest, the soft crunch of leaves beneath your feet, the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. My thoughts wandered. I was thinking about everything and nothing at the same time. Work, family, that one awkward conversation I had with a colleague last week. It was nice to have space to think. The trail started to climb after the first few miles, becoming steeper and rockier. The air grew cooler the higher I went, and the forest around me grew denser. The trees were tall and thick, their branches reaching high above to block out most of the sunlight. It wasn't dark, but the shade made it feel like the world was turning slower. As I climbed higher, the trail became less and less defined. I was following the faint marks of a trail, but it wasn't as obvious as it had been earlier. I had to pay more attention, watching my step carefully, making sure I didn't trip on the uneven ground. My mind was starting to clear, focusing on the rhythm of my breathing and the sound of my boots against the dirt. It was around the 4th mile when I first noticed something strange. The trees here were much older, their trunks wide and twisted, like they'd been standing for centuries. But there was something else. The air felt different. I couldn't quite place it, but it was heavier somehow, thick with silence. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling were almost completely absent. I looked around, half expecting to see something moving in the corner of my eye, but there was nothing. I stopped for a moment, looking around. I had hiked in many different forests, but this one felt different. I couldn't explain why. It wasn't necessarily a bad feeling, but it was unsettling, as if the forest was holding its breath. After a moment, I shook it off. It was probably just the isolation. The more remote areas of the forest always felt like that, especially once you got far enough from civilization. I pushed forward, trying to ignore the growing unease in the back of my mind. About a mile after that, I reached a small creek. The sound of running water was a relief, breaking the eerie quiet that had settled over the woods. I stopped to refill my water bottle and to take a short break. I perched on a rock near the creek and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the water gurgling over the stones. I was about to continue on when I noticed something strange again. It was a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. I cocked my head to the side, trying to focus. It sounded like a distant, low hum, like the sound of wind moving through the trees, but it wasn't quite right. The trees around me weren't swaying, and there was no breeze to speak of. The hum was steady, constant. For a moment, I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. The sound wasn't coming from any specific direction, and it was hard to pin down exactly where it was coming from. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind after all, or maybe an animal, some kind of insect, I told myself. Still, it felt wrong. I glanced around the clearing, my eyes scanning the trees. There was something off about this place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the air was pressing in, making the space feel tighter, smaller. My heart rate quickened as I stood up, feeling the urge to keep moving. Maybe I was just imagining things. I followed the creek upstream, climbing over rocks and pushing through underbrush. The humming noise faded, but the weird feeling lingered. The farther I went, the more I realized how deep into the forest I had come. The trail had all but disappeared by now, and I was walking on the edge of a dense thicket. The ground was wet and uneven, and I had to watch every step to avoid slipping. Then, something caught my attention, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, like a shadow, darting between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought it might have been a deer or some other animal, but the movement was too fast, too deliberate. It didn't feel like an animal at all. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining my ears, trying to catch any sound, any sign of what it might have been. The forest around me was deathly still, and I felt like I was being watched. My hands tightened around the straps of my pack, and I started to feel the weight of the isolation again. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. I turned back, deciding to retrace my steps. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn. The weird feeling in my chest started to grow, and I knew I needed to get out of here, fast. As I made my way back toward the creek, I stumbled, my foot catching on a hidden root. I caught myself just before I fell, but it didn't matter. The moment I got back on my feet, I heard it again. The hum, louder this time. It was coming from all around me. The trees, the ground, the air itself seemed to hum in a way that wasn't natural. The noise wasn't just a sound. It felt like pressure, like something was bearing down on me. I broke into a run, my breath ragged as I sprinted through the woods, trying to make my way back to the trailhead. My mind raced, panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was behind me. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I reached the clearing near the creek again, gasping for air, my legs burning. The hum had stopped. The forest was quiet once more. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all, if it was my own fear making things seem worse than they were. But I didn't care. I was out. I made my way back to the truck without incident. As I drove down the winding road back toward town, I tried to shake off the feeling, but it stuck with me. Something about that place felt wrong, and I knew I wouldn't be returning. The woods had whispered something to me that day, something I couldn't quite understand. But I was safe now. That's all that mattered. I was 34 the summer I decided to take time off from everything. My name is David, and I'd been working for almost 10 years straight as a warehouse supervisor just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. It was a rough job, lots of overtime, not much time off, and I'd recently hit a point where everything just felt too much. My knees hurt all the time, I wasn't sleeping well, and I felt like I hadn't had a real thought to myself in months. That year, 2021, I finally told myself enough was enough. I cashed in all the vacation time I had built up and decided I was going to spend a whole week alone in the woods. I used to hike a lot when I was younger. My uncle got me into it when I was a teenager, and for a while I even thought about doing one of those long trails that take months to finish, like the Appalachian Trail. Life had other plans. Bills, work, responsibilities. All that stuff piled up, and the idea of long hikes slowly slipped away. But I never really stopped loving it. I'd watch videos of trail hikes online during lunch breaks and read forums about ultralight gear and survival tips when I couldn't sleep. So when I finally had the time, I knew what I wanted. I picked a spot called Flatstone Ridge. It's in the Daniel Boone National Forest, about a 3-hour drive from my place. The trail was supposed to be hard but manageable, not too popular, which I liked, and it was long enough that I could be out there for 4 or 5 days without seeing too many people. It looped around through a long stretch of ridge lines, old forest, and even had a couple of overlooks that showed the whole valley below. I planned it out carefully. I bought a new pack, a new water filter, fresh boots, and spent weeks going over every detail. I even went on a couple of short weekend hikes just to get my legs used to it again. Everything seemed fine. I was excited. The plan was simple. 5 days on the trail, carrying all my food, sleeping out in a tent, moving from spot to spot each day. No distractions, no people, just trees, dirt, and my thoughts. Day 1 went smooth. I parked my truck at the main lot around noon. The weather was hot but clear. I made it about 8 miles in before I stopped for the night. I set up my tent on a flat stretch of dirt next to a creek, filtered some water, ate one of the dehydrated meals I brought, and lay there watching the sun go down through the trees. The bugs came out, but I had spray. I remember feeling calm, like I had made the right choice. Day 2 was harder. The trail got steeper. The ridge line was covered in broken rock and loose dirt. I had to stop more often to catch my breath. But the views were incredible. Miles and miles of untouched forest, cliffs, and distant lakes. I didn't see a single person the entire day. That night, I camped near a dry creek bed about halfway up a slope. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but I was too tired to keep looking. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something crunching leaves outside my tent. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I didn't panic. I stayed still, waited a while, then slowly unzipped the flap and looked out with my flashlight. Whatever it was had already moved on. I didn't sleep much after that, though. Day 3 was when things started to go wrong. It rained. Not just a light shower either. It started around mid-morning, and by noon it was coming down so hard I couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The trail turned to mud. My clothes were soaked through even with the rain gear. Every step felt like a slip waiting to happen. I almost twisted my ankle at one point when a rock rolled out from under me. I had planned to hike 10 miles that day, but I only made it about 6 before I gave up and started looking for a place to set up camp. The problem was everything was wet. Every flat space was either flooded or covered in mud. I ended up setting my tent up on a slope under some thick trees. It was better than nothing, but the ground was soft and kept sagging under me. That night I couldn't get warm. My sleeping bag was damp, my socks were soaked, and I could feel my body starting to ache. I tried to eat, but I wasn't hungry. I just sat there listening to the rain pound the tarp above me and wondered if I should turn back the next day. But I didn't. I told myself I could do it. I'd already made it halfway, and the forecast said the rain was supposed to clear by the next morning. I figured if I could just push through one more day, things would get better. Day 4 was clear, but the trail was a mess. I had to climb over trees that had fallen from the storm and wade through parts where the trail had turned into a stream. I lost the markers more than once. The mud was so thick in places that I had to use a stick to pull my boot out. My legs burned from the effort, and I started getting cramps in my thighs. I kept checking the map, trying to figure out how far I'd gone, but something wasn't lining up. The terrain didn't match what I was seeing. I figured maybe I had taken a wrong turn. I had the GPS on my phone, but I was in a dead zone, and the signal kept dropping. I kept moving, hoping to hit the next big marker, a place called Deer Hollow, but it never came. I walked for hours and never saw anything familiar. The worst part was I didn't want to admit I was lost. I found an old fire ring just before dark, which meant someone had camped there before. It gave me a little confidence. I set up my tent, filtered water from a nearby stream, and ate a small meal. I was tired, dirty, and starting to feel worn down in a way that was different from just being tired. I could feel the weight of everything building in my chest. I lay awake most of the night again, listening. I didn't hear anything strange, but something about the air felt different, heavy. Day 5 started quiet. The sun came out. The birds were chirping. I packed up early and tried to backtrack to where I thought I went wrong. I climbed a ridge I didn't remember, hoping to get a better view. That's when I realized I had no idea where I was. Everything looked the same: trees, hills, valleys. The trail was gone. I found what looked like a deer path and followed it, but it led nowhere. My legs hurt so bad I had to sit down every 15 minutes. I was running low on food and had maybe a liter of clean water left. Around noon, I made the worst decision of the trip. I saw what looked like an old logging road off to my right. It wasn't on my map, but it was wide and looked traveled, like maybe it led somewhere. I figured it might hook back into the main trail or lead to a service road. I followed it for hours. At first it seemed fine, but then the road started climbing higher, steeper. My calves were burning, and then it just stopped. Dead end. No sign, no trail, just thick brush and drop-offs on either side. I tried turning around, but after walking for about an hour, I realized the road had forked at some point, and I had taken the wrong one. That was when panic really hit. My chest got tight. I couldn't think straight. I dropped my pack and sat down with my back against a tree, just breathing hard and trying not to cry. I knew the sun would go down in a couple of hours, and I had no idea where I was. My GPS was still out, and I hadn't seen another person in 4 days. I checked my phone again. Still no bars. I took out the emergency beacon I'd brought, a little thing that could send a signal if I held the button for 10 seconds. I had kept telling myself I wouldn't use it unless it was a life or death situation. But now, sitting there with shaking hands, I knew I was close. I held the button down. It blinked red. Signal sent. I didn't know if it worked. I didn't know if anyone would even get it, but it was all I had. I set up camp right there on the trail. No flat ground, just rocks and tree roots. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking about what would happen if nobody came. if the battery died, if I slipped and broke something. The next morning, I packed everything again, sore, hungry, and barely holding it together. I decided to keep moving. I didn't want to just sit and wait. I figured I'd follow the sun west and hope to hit a road or something. About 3 hours later, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A power line, just one, cut across the ridge, running in a straight line down into the valley below. I knew that meant there had to be a service road somewhere down there. I followed it. I didn't care how steep it was. I slid on mud, grabbed onto branches, tore my hands up on rocks. But I didn't stop. It took me almost 2 more hours to reach the bottom. But when I got there, I saw a gravel road, a real one, with tire tracks. I dropped my pack and started walking along it, shouting even though I hadn't seen anyone. About 30 minutes later, I heard a vehicle, a Forest Service truck. They had gotten my emergency beacon. They found me. The ranger gave me water and snacks and told me I was about 6 miles off the main trail. Said it happens more than people think. I was lucky to have the beacon. I cried in the back seat of that truck the whole way down the mountain. When I got home, I slept for 2 straight days. My legs were covered in bruises. I'd lost almost 12 pounds, and I had blisters the size of quarters on both feet. But I was alive. I still hike now and then, but I don't go out alone anymore. And I never ignore my gut again. When the trail feels wrong, I stop. When I'm tired, I rest. And I always know where I am. The woods don't care how much you prepared. They don't care how strong or smart you think you are. The early morning fog had settled over the woods, thick enough to obscure everything but the trees right in front of me. I've been planning this hike for months. It was supposed to be my way of clearing my head, getting away from the noise and stress of everyday life. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me and nature. But as I stood at the trailhead, looking into the thick fog, a knot began to form in my stomach. I'd parked my truck in the lot a few hundred yards back, where the gravel road met the start of the trail. I hadn't seen anyone around, not a single car, which seemed strange for a Saturday morning. Maybe that's why it felt off. The emptiness of the place made me uneasy, even though it was the last thing I expected when planning a solo hike in the Appalachian Mountains. The trail itself was a narrow, worn path that snaked through dense trees and thick underbrush. I had picked a route that was known for its quiet beauty and solitude. I wasn't expecting anything extreme, just a steady climb up to a ridge with a good view. I had been on plenty of hikes before, but this one felt different. I chalked it up to being alone. Maybe the quiet got to me more than I realized. The first hour was just like any other hike. The smell of pine trees, damp earth, and fallen leaves filled the air. The soft crunch of dried leaves underfoot was the only sound. There were no animals stirring, no birds singing. I didn't think much of it. It was early. Maybe the animals were still asleep or just avoiding the thick fog that wrapped the woods. As I pressed on, the trail began to get steeper. I was starting to sweat a little, but I didn't mind. The physical exertion felt good, like I was getting into the rhythm of the hike. But then, something caught my attention, something I couldn't explain. The forest grew unnervingly silent. Not just the lack of animals, but even the wind had died down. Felt like I was in a vacuum. I stopped for a second, scanning the woods around me, trying to shake off the odd feeling in my gut. But there was nothing. No breeze, no movement, no sound of water from any nearby streams or rivers. Just the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching me. I'd hiked these woods before, or at least similar ones, and never had I felt this isolated. I pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink, hoping the uneasy feeling would pass. But it didn't. As I continued up the trail, the fog began to thicken again, almost to the point where I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. That's when I noticed it. A mark on one of the trees, carved into the bark with something sharp. I stopped, crouching down to inspect it. The carving was crude, not a symbol or design, just deep gouges in the bark, as if someone had been marking the trees for some reason. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a trail marker, or at least not one I recognized. I stood up, scanning the area around me, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept walking, trying to focus on the trail ahead, but it was hard to ignore the strange quiet. The silence was pressing in, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to think of something else, anything else, but my mind kept returning to the strange mark on the tree. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A symbol? Or just the work of some random person? It wasn't long before I saw something else that added to the unease. Up ahead, through the fog, I saw a figure standing by the side of the trail. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, so the sudden appearance of someone made me freeze. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized the figure wasn't moving. It was a person, but they weren't reacting to my approach. They were standing still, their back to me, facing away into the trees. I called out, "Hey, you all right?" But there was no response. The figure remained motionless, their posture unnaturally still. I stopped in my tracks, my instincts telling me to turn around and leave. But I pushed the feeling down, telling myself it was just some hiker who'd taken a break and maybe was deep in thought. Still, the longer I looked at the person, the more uneasy I became. I took a few tentative steps closer, keeping my distance. The figure wore a dark jacket and pants, and their hair was covered by a hood. They were standing near a tree, almost like they were waiting for something. But that stillness, it didn't sit right with me. It felt off, like they weren't just resting. My throat felt tight, and I found it hard to swallow. "Hey, you okay?" I called out again, this time a little louder. No response, no movement, just the fog rolling around them. I felt a sudden compulsion to leave, to get away from this odd scene. Slowly, I turned and started walking back down the trail. My steps quickened as I heard the faintest sound behind me, like someone shifting their weight. I glanced back, half expecting to see the figure following me, but there was nothing, just the fog. My breath came out in quick, shallow bursts. I was beginning to panic, but I forced myself to calm down. I told myself I was overreacting. It wasn't like the person was threatening me. They were probably just some hiker like me. I pressed on, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The silence felt more suffocating now, the air thicker. And then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something that made my heart stop. Another mark. It was on the bark of a tree, just like the first one. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a few scratches, it was a large, jagged gash, the kind that looked like it had been made by something sharp, maybe even a knife. My hand trembled as I reached out and touched it. The bark was still fresh, the edges damp as though it had been made recently. I was about to pull my hand away when I heard a noise from behind me, a rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the trees. But there was nothing, only the thick, impenetrable fog. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and started walking faster, almost running now. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig made my blood run cold. I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, trying to ignore the panic that clawed at my chest. I'd been hiking for almost 3 hours by the time I finally reached the ridge. The fog had lifted slightly, and I could see out over the valley below. The view should have been breathtaking, but all I could focus on was the tight knot in my stomach. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stopped for a moment, catching my breath, when I saw it, just across the ridge, near a cluster of rocks. There was something or someone moving. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure was too far away to get a clear look. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whatever it wasn't moving like a person. It moved unnaturally, too fast, too jerky, like it was being dragged along by some invisible force. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned around and started back down the trail, almost running at this point. The silence had returned, but now it felt worse. It felt like I was being hunted. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead again, breathless and terrified. The parking lot was still empty. No cars, no people, just me and the woods. I quickly grabbed my backpack from the bed of my truck and threw it into the back seat. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys, my mind racing. I wanted to leave, to get out of there as fast as possible, but I couldn't help but look over my shoulder at the trailhead. Nothing moved. It took me almost an hour to drive back to the nearest town. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind kept replaying the events of the hike over and over. What had I seen? Had I imagined the figure? The strange marks on the trees? Or had there been something out there? Something that didn't belong? I've hiked those woods before and I've hiked them since. But I'll never forget that day. The strange silence. The unexplainable feeling that I wasn't alone. Whatever it was, I'm glad I left when I did. Some places, some trails hold secrets, and I don't think I want to know what secrets those woods were hiding. I was 34 when I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. Take a solo hiking trip. It wasn't some grand challenge or spiritual retreat, nothing like that. I just wanted quiet. I'd been stuck in a rut after a breakup and was feeling burned out at work. The same routines every day, the same cheap dinners alone, the same drive through traffic, the same four walls every night. I needed out even just for a while. I used to hike a lot when I was younger, so I figured getting back into it might help me clear my head. I chose a place in the Appalachian foothills of northern Georgia. It was far enough from home in Alabama to feel like an escape, but not so far that it would take a full day to drive. I found a trail system online that wasn't heavily trafficked but still had a few reviews from backpackers. The reviews were mixed. Some said it was peaceful and beautiful. Others said it was too isolated, poorly marked, and full of steep climbs that weren't worth the effort. That actually sold me on it. I didn't want crowds, I didn't want a paved tourist path, and I wasn't afraid of a few rough hills. I drove out early on a Thursday morning in mid-October. I wanted to avoid any weekend hikers and figured I'd have the trail mostly to myself. The weather was good, cool, and dry with highs in the mid-60s. Perfect for hiking. I packed 3 days worth of food, my tent, my stove, water filter, the usual gear. I didn't skimp on safety stuff either. I had a satellite messenger, an emergency whistle, a knife, and extra batteries. I was careful, always have been. I parked at a small gravel lot near a ranger station that looked closed for the season. A weathered wooden sign marked the trailhead, Ridge Loop Trail, 23.7 miles. The trail was a loop that followed a ridge for most of the way, then dipped down into a valley before looping back around to the starting point. I planned to hike counterclockwise, taking my time and making camp somewhere around the halfway point. The trail started off easy, wide and gently sloping, covered in fallen leaves that rustled underfoot. The forest was quiet, but not in a creepy way, just peaceful. The only sounds were the breeze moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. I passed a couple of dry creek beds and a rusted metal sign pointing toward an old fire road, but I stuck to the main trail. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to calm. By late afternoon, the trail started to climb. The slope wasn't brutal, but it was steady, and I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. The trees started thinning out, replaced by thick underbrush and scraggly shrubs. There weren't many switchbacks, just a long, steady incline that followed the ridge line. I didn't see another soul the whole time. Around 5 o'clock, I found a decent spot to camp, flat enough to pitch my tent, a few yards off the trail, and just secluded enough behind a cluster of pines that I wouldn't be visible to any passerby. Not that I expected any. I set up my tent, filtered some water from a trickling spring I'd found earlier, and heated a packet of rice and beans. I ate while sitting on a fallen log, watching the sky turn a deep orange as the sun dipped behind the trees. That first night was uneventful. I heard some animal movement in the brush, probably deer, and once what sounded like a barred owl, but nothing unusual. I slept well. The next morning, I woke up early, ate a protein bar, and broke camp. The trail grew rougher after that point. It narrowed and tilted along the slope of the ridge, with drop-offs on one side that made me pay closer attention to where I was stepping. The wind was stronger up there too, especially in the exposed areas where the trees had thinned out. A few sections had washouts where the trail had eroded, and I had to scramble over some loose rock. Around midday, I came across an old wooden structure just off the trail. Looked like what used to be a trail shelter, or maybe even a ranger station decades ago. The roof had collapsed in one corner, and most of the walls were rotting through. I peeked inside and saw nothing but broken boards, moss, and some rusted metal cans. I didn't linger. It had an uneasy feel to it. Not haunted or anything, just forgotten. Like something that had once been useful and now was just being swallowed by the woods. A little after 3 in the afternoon, I reached a narrow section of the ridge that felt different. I don't know how to explain it exactly. It wasn't supernatural, just off. The trail curved along a steep drop to the right, and on the left was a sharp, rocky slope climbing up at an angle that looked unclimbable. The trees were smaller, stunted even, and there were more dead ones than I'd seen elsewhere on the trail. The ground was dry and packed hard, but something about it felt unstable. I slowed my pace. Then I saw it. A boot, not a pair, just one. Caked in dirt, old, the laces frayed. It was off the side of the trail, down the slope a bit, like it had tumbled down and landed heel up in the dirt. I stared at it for a while. It could have been trash, sure, but something about seeing it there, alone and half buried, made me feel uneasy. I took a photo just in case it was worth reporting, and moved on. The ridge got worse after that. More eroded sections, more loose footing. At one point, I had to crouch down and crawl across a short, narrow section where the trail had crumbled away completely. There was nothing to hold on to, just dry dirt and a steep drop to the right. It was slow going, and my nerves were starting to fray. By the time I made it past that section, it was already close to dusk. I hadn't found a good campsite, and I was too far from any flat ground I'd passed earlier to turn back. I kept moving, my headlamp ready in case I lost the light too soon. That's when I noticed the noise. First, I thought it was just the wind. It came in short bursts, whistling, then quiet. But then I realized it had a rhythm to it. Not natural, more like footfalls, but uneven. I stopped walking and the sound stopped too. I waited. Nothing. I took a few steps. The sound came back. It wasn't loud, but it was there. And it wasn't an echo. It was coming from somewhere below the ridge, down the slope to the right. I stood still for what felt like forever, heart pounding. I couldn't see anything through the trees and brush, not in the fading light. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal moving parallel to me. But it wasn't a smooth sound. It was broken, deliberate, and uneven, like someone walking with a limp or dragging a leg. I moved faster after that. I didn't run. I couldn't on that terrain, but I didn't stop again. I kept my headlamp ready, but didn't turn it on until it was pitch dark. By then, I was so tense I kept imagining things in the trees every time my beam hit a branch the wrong way. Eventually, I found a tiny clearing just off the trail. It wasn't ideal, rocky and exposed, but I was too tired to care. I pitched the tent in record time, got inside, zipped everything up, and laid there, heart still racing. I didn't cook dinner. I didn't even change out of my sweaty clothes. I just listened, and I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time slower, closer, on the trail. I stayed completely still. My hand was on the handle of my knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. The sound moved past my tent, soft but real, slow, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. But I heard it, and it kept going, then faded into the distance. I didn't sleep. When morning finally came, I packed up fast and didn't even eat. I just wanted off that ridge. I checked my GPS and saw I still had nearly 10 miles to go before I'd hit the loop's return stretch. I moved fast but carefully. Every noise made me flinch. Every shadow felt like something was about to step out of it. I never saw anyone. No hikers, no rangers, nothing. I made it to the final stretch around 3 p.m. The trail dipped down into thicker woods, and the footing improved. I was physically exhausted, but I kept going. I didn't stop again until I saw the gravel lot through the trees. I've never been so relieved in my life. I got in my car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while. My hands were shaking. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, the boot, the steps outside the tent, that feeling of being followed. When I got home, I sent a report to the local ranger office. I told them about the boot, the broken trail sections, the structure I found. I didn't mention the footsteps. I figured they'd just dismiss it, and maybe I would have too if it hadn't felt so real. But I knew what I heard. A few weeks later, I got a short email back. They thanked me for the report, said they'd send someone to inspect the trail in the spring. Nothing else. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I still go with friends sometimes, but I stay away from ridges. And when I camp, I only do it in designated areas, even if it means hearing other people around. That trip was supposed to help me clear my head. In a way, it did. It reminded me how quickly things can go wrong when you're alone in the wild. How easily someone or something can disappear out there without a trace. The boot I saw, it never left my mind. Because sometimes I wonder if someone else had stood in that same spot years ago, hearing footsteps just like I did, and they didn't make it back. I was 31 the year I decided to take a solo hiking trip up north. It was late September 2017, and the weather in northern Wyoming was already starting to turn. I had some time off work from the landscaping company I ran in Denver, and I wanted something quieter than the city and different from my usual weekend hikes in Colorado. I'd spent the past few months planning something that would push me a bit further. Not something extreme, just enough to feel like I'd earned the views at the top. I ended up settling on a lesser-known trail called Pine Ridge Loop. It wasn't marked on most tourist maps, but I found it online through a forum. It was remote, wrapped around a ridge line with steep drops, and looped back after about 22 miles total. No crowds, no campgrounds, just forest, rock, and air. I left early on a Wednesday morning, the air chilly but not freezing. My old truck made it to the rough pull-off where the Forest Service road ended and the trail started. I parked just off the path, locked everything down, and double-checked my pack. I had enough food and water for 4 days. My tent, lightweight and compact, was secured inside. A basic first aid kit, a small solar charger, a knife, a GPS beacon, and my phone, all there. I'd hiked alone before, but never this far out. I felt ready. The first few miles were smooth. The trail was a bit overgrown in places, and fallen trees had made some sections slow. But I liked that. It made me feel like I'd picked something real, not manicured for weekend hikers. The air was crisp and dry, pine needles crunching beneath my boots. I moved at a good pace, stopping only to take in the ridgeline views when they opened up through the trees. No human noise at all, just the occasional crack of branches in the wind or the distant tapping of woodpeckers. By mid-afternoon, I'd made it about 8 miles in. I found a spot just off the trail where the trees opened up into a slight clearing, enough space to set up camp for the night. I cleared the spot with my boots, pitched the tent, and made a quick meal with my camping stove. Rice, beans, and a little smoked sausage I'd vacuum sealed for the trip. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped myself up inside the sleeping bag and read for a bit before shutting off my headlamp. The night was cold, but I slept fine. Woke up around 6 a.m. with some condensation inside the tent. I made instant coffee and oatmeal, packed up, and started back on the trail. It got rougher. The path followed the edge of the ridge more closely now, sometimes so narrow I had to move sideways to pass sections where erosion had chewed away at the rock. One misstep and you'd be tumbling 50 feet down into thick forest or worse. I moved carefully, slowing my pace and using my trekking poles more often. By noon, I stopped for a break. I found a rock outcrop where I could sit and let my legs rest. That's when I noticed something strange. Not exactly wrong, just off. A rustling in the trees below. First, I figured it was deer, maybe elk, but the movement was too slow and too straight. It wasn't an animal hopping through underbrush. It was a steady path. I stood and squinted down the slope. I didn't see anything, but I got that weird prickling feeling, like when someone's watching you, even though you don't know for sure. I brushed it off. Animals move in weird ways all the time. I ate a protein bar, finished my water, and got back on the trail. About 2 hours later, I reached the halfway point of the loop. There was a small stream that cut across the trail, shallow and clear, running down toward the thicker woods below. I refilled my bottles, filtered the water, and took a short rest. That's when I found the boot print. Not mine, not even close. The tread was different and it looked fresher than mine. A bigger foot, maybe a size 12 heavy, pressed deep into the mud near the bank. But there were no prints leading to it or away from it. Just the one. It didn't make sense. The ground was soft, and my own boots left a clear trail both ways. Whoever made that print should have left more than one. I stood still for a long time, staring down the slope, listening hard. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Not silent, but it had that stillness that didn't sit right. I told myself maybe it was an old print and erosion just wiped the rest out. It didn't help much, but I moved on. That night I camped again, this time near a flat section about 15 miles into the loop. The spot was harder to find. The trees were denser, and the ground was uneven, filled with roots and moss-covered rocks. I managed to carve out a small flat patch and set up the tent. I didn't cook that night, just ate some jerky and trail mix. I felt uneasy, like something was near. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the woods around me. I didn't see anything, but that feeling didn't go away. I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside the tent made me sit up. Twigs snapping, wind shifting the trees. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps, slow and dragging. But when I unzipped the tent and flashed my light around, there was nothing. The next morning, I was more tired than I'd been in a long time. I packed up fast and didn't eat until I was back on the trail. I just wanted to finish the loop and get out. The trail climbed higher again, back along the edge of the ridge. More loose rocks, more steep drops. I had to really concentrate now, especially with how tired I was. My legs were sore, and my knees ached with every downhill section. It was around midday when things got worse. I was crossing a narrow ledge, maybe 3 feet wide, with a wall of rock on my left and a sheer drop on my right. I was about halfway across when I heard movement behind me, quick and light. I turned fast, heart in my throat. No one was there. The trail behind me was empty. I kept moving, faster now, nearly lost my footing once. That would have been it. I took a deep breath, forced myself to slow down. I figured I was just rattled, probably hearing animals and freaking myself out. But deep down, I didn't believe that. About an hour later, I reached a fork in the trail. That was the final straw. There wasn't supposed to be a fork. I had the map printed out, had the GPS, and both told me this trail looped in one direction, no forks. But there it was. One path curved up toward a rocky incline. The other dipped down into a darker section of forest. Neither looked used. No footprints, no markers. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes trying to decide. The GPS wasn't helping. The tree cover was too thick for a solid signal, and the arrow kept shifting directions. I picked the upward trail. I thought maybe I'd get a better signal higher up. It was steep, full of loose rock, and halfway up I slipped and scraped my hand bad. Blood ran down my fingers. I tore a strip of cloth from my pack and wrapped it. My hands shook while I did it, and not just from pain. At the top, there was no signal, just more rocks and thick trees. The trail disappeared completely. I stood there, breathing hard, trying not to panic. I couldn't backtrack now, not with the ridge that narrow and dangerous. So I pushed through the trees, trying to find the trail again. After about half a mile, I saw something that stopped me cold. Tarp, blue, torn on one side and barely held down with rocks. I crouched low, heart pounding, and moved closer. Underneath the tarp were old food wrappers, a broken camp chair, and a sleeping bag, moldy and collapsed. The air smelled wrong, rot and mildew and something else. I looked around fast, trying to find any sign of who had camped here. Nothing recent, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like whoever had been there hadn't planned on leaving for long. I didn't stay. I moved fast, pushing through the trees until I finally hit something like a trail again. It looked faint, overgrown, but it headed in the general direction of where the loop should have gone. I followed it for hours. My feet were blistered, legs throbbing. I stopped only to drink and change socks once. The sun was dipping low again, and I had no desire to camp anywhere near that tarp. That night, I didn't use the tent. I found a patch of pine needles beneath a low-hanging tree and wrapped myself in the emergency blanket. I stayed half awake the whole night, heart racing every time I heard movement. Something was out there. I don't know what, but it wasn't an animal. Animals don't follow like that. They don't move when you move. They don't stop when you stop. When morning finally came, I forced myself up and followed the trail again. I had no clue where I was on the loop now. Everything looked the same. Rocks, trees, moss. I was starting to feel the edge of real panic now. I hadn't seen a marker in over a day. My food was almost gone. Water low. Then I heard it, water, rushing. I moved toward the sound, slipping down a steep hill, grabbing onto branches. At the bottom was a stream wide and fast. Across it, the land opened up a bit and I saw something I hadn't seen in days. A man-made structure. A wooden trail sign, cracked and leaning, but there. I crossed the stream, boots soaked, and read the sign. It pointed toward the trailhead. For miles. I almost collapsed right there. I took the week off from work in early October 2019. I was 34 at the time, single, and needed a break from everything. I lived in a small town in Colorado, worked long hours at a machine shop, and rarely had more than a couple of days to myself. That fall, I promised myself I'd do something different, not just sit at home. I wanted to go out where there was no signal, no traffic, and no people. I picked a remote hiking trail I found online, not far from the Utah border. It looked rugged but beautiful. It had everything I wanted: cliffs, forests, views, and the kind of silence I couldn't find anywhere near home. The trail was called Ridge Loop, though it barely resembled a loop. It was more like a long horseshoe. According to the website, it was around 27 miles total, usually done over 2 to 3 days. It wasn't maintained regularly and wasn't popular, so I figured I'd have the whole place to myself. I brought enough food for 4 days, packed a sleeping bag, small tent, water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, and my old hiking boots that had never let me down. I also carried a paper map and compass, just in case my GPS died, though I didn't expect to use them. I parked my truck at a small gravel lot at the base of the trailhead early in the morning. The sun was barely up, and the air was cold and crisp. There was only one other vehicle in the lot, a beat-up sedan with out-of-state plates. I remember thinking it was odd for someone else to be out there, especially on a weekday, but I didn't think much more about it. I tightened my backpack, locked the truck, and started the trail. The first part of Ridge Loop was a steep climb. It took me through dense pine woods, full of fallen needles that muffled the sound of my footsteps. As I got higher, the trees thinned out and the trail became rockier. After 3 hours, I made it to a small overlook that opened up to a wide valley below. It was the kind of view that made the sore muscles worth it. There were no buildings, no roads, no people. Just endless trees, steep slopes, and faraway cliffs. I felt lucky to be there. I didn't see or hear anyone all morning. I hiked for another few hours before setting up camp just before sundown. I found a decent flat patch near a rock outcrop that blocked some of the wind. I set up my tent, boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal, and sat quietly, watching the last light of the day disappear. That night, I slept hard. The kind of sleep that only comes after hours of physical effort and fresh air. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees outside. The second day was easier in the morning. The trail evened out and followed the edge of a ridge for several miles. I passed some old weathered signs that were barely readable. They looked like they hadn't been replaced in years. The trail forked a couple of times, but the map and GPS both showed I was still on Ridge Loop, so I wasn't worried. By mid-afternoon, I came across something that made me stop. Just off the trail, maybe 30 yards into the trees, there was a collapsed tent. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but as I got closer, I saw it had been crushed by a fallen branch. The fabric was shredded, and gear was scattered all around. An old sleeping bag, cooking utensils, even a cracked plastic water bottle. Everything looked weathered, like it had been there for months. I didn't see any trash or signs of an animal, just the broken tent and the gear. I stood there for a while, looking around. It felt wrong somehow, like something had been abandoned in a hurry. I checked for footprints, but the ground was too dry and covered in leaves. I took a few pictures with my phone and moved on. I figured someone had probably gotten scared off by the weather or maybe injured and airlifted out. That kind of stuff happens. But something about that tent stayed with me for the rest of the day. I set up camp further down the trail that night near a small creek. I kept thinking about that gear. It didn't look like anyone had come back for it. I wondered if the sedan at the trailhead belonged to whoever left it. The thought crept into my head, and I couldn't shake it. That night was colder. I could hear the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of branches. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up sweating and full of dread. I couldn't explain it. I didn't hear anything specific, but I felt like something was wrong. I stayed completely still inside my sleeping bag, listening. My breath was loud in the tent. The wind was still going strong. I didn't hear footsteps or voices, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I laid there until the sky started to lighten, then packed up and kept going. I wanted to finish the loop and get back to the truck. I figured I could do the last 15 miles in one long day if I didn't stop much. My legs were sore, but I pushed through it. A few hours in, the trail started to climb again, steep and rocky. I was sweating even though it was cold. I reached the top of the ridge around mid-afternoon. It was the highest point of the trail. The view was incredible, cliffs on one side, a thick forest on the other. But there was something else up there too. Just past the edge of the trail, I saw a small pile of stones stacked into a kind of marker. I thought it was a cairn at first, maybe left by other hikers. But it was different, taller, more deliberate. Around it were bones, small animal bones, maybe rabbit or squirrel, arranged in a neat circle. Some of them were blackened, like they'd been burned. I just stared at it for a while. It didn't feel like a joke or some nature art thing. It felt like something I wasn't supposed to find. I didn't touch it. I didn't take a picture. I just backed away and kept walking. The trail started to descend sharply after that. I could see the valley floor below and figured I had maybe 6 miles left. That was when I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It wasn't footsteps or noises. It was just this growing feeling that someone was behind me. I kept looking over my shoulder. At first, there was nothing, just trees and rocks and wind. But then I saw something. About 100 yards back, barely visible between the trees, was a figure. It was a man, standing perfectly still. He wasn't walking or moving at all, just standing there, partially hidden. He wore dark clothes, but that's all I could tell. I stared for a few seconds, then kept moving fast. I didn't run, but I picked up the pace. Every 5 minutes I'd check behind me. The figure was always there, never closer, never gone, just there. I stopped once to pretend to tie my boot and looked through the trees. Nothing. Then when I turned back around, he was standing ahead of me now, maybe 50 yards off, just past the bend in the trail. He wasn't facing me directly. He was angled slightly to the side. I froze. My heart was pounding hard in my chest. I stood there for almost a full minute. He didn't move. I turned off the trail and cut through the woods, keeping an eye on him the whole time. I don't know how long I bushwhacked through the trees, maybe 2 hours. I used the compass to keep myself heading downhill. I wanted to reach the road at the bottom that I knew the trail eventually led to. I stopped only once to drink water and catch my breath. I didn't see the man again, but I felt like he was always close. When I finally saw the road, I nearly cried. It was gravel and empty, but it led straight to the parking lot where I'd left my truck. I followed it for about 2 miles before I reached it. The lot was empty now. The sedan was gone. Just my truck remained. I opened the door, threw my pack in the back, and sat behind the wheel for a while, trying to calm myself down. I looked around once more before starting the engine. There was no one in sight. I drove straight back to town and didn't stop until I got home. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the man on the trail. I couldn't explain him. He didn't chase me. He didn't speak. He didn't even move. But he was there, and he was watching. A few days later, I reported the abandoned tent to the county ranger office. They told me they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't mention the man. I didn't want them to think I'd imagined it. I also didn't want to know what might have happened out there. I never found out who the man was. I never went back to Ridge Loop, and I haven't hiked alone since. But the worst part? The GPS history on my phone showed I hadn't gone off the trail. Not once. Even when I thought I had cut through the woods, I was still on it. The whole time. It was late September 2014 when I decided to do a solo hiking trip in the Sawatch Range of central Colorado. I was 33 at the time, recently single, and going through one of those phases where everything in life feels a bit off. My job felt like a dead end. I had just moved into a small one-bedroom apartment after splitting from my long-term girlfriend, and I didn't really have many close friends anymore. Most had moved away or drifted apart, and I found myself spending weekends alone, bored out of my mind. So I figured a long hike might reset my brain. I'd done smaller day hikes before, and 1 or 2 overnighters with friends, but never something fully solo for multiple days. I told myself I'd hike a loop around some of the quieter trails near Mount Yale, far from the more popular routes. I didn't want people. I wanted silence. Trees, rocks, sky. I packed what I thought I needed: sleeping bag, tent, water filter, stove, a bare canister with dehydrated meals and granola bars, and extra socks. I brought a compass and a map, but no GPS. I had a flip phone with no signal, and I told a coworker I'd be back in 4 days. That was it. I parked at a little pull-off near a dirt forest road that led into the Collegiate Peaks wilderness. There was a trailhead sign half buried in weeds. I wrote my name in the register at the trailhead box and started hiking in. The first day felt good. It was cool but sunny. I made about 9 miles before setting up camp in a grove of aspens. I didn't see a single person all day. No noise, no signs of life except the occasional squirrel or woodpecker. Just me, the breeze, and the crunch of leaves. I felt good that first night. Proud, independent, like I was finally doing something that wasn't work or routine. Day 2 started normal. I had oatmeal and instant coffee packed up and kept moving. The trail was less maintained than I expected. More like a faint path between brush and pines, with a few old trail markers nailed to trees if you looked hard enough. I followed the map as best I could, but by mid-afternoon, I had a sense something was off. The trail was curving too far west, and I should have been going more northeast. I pulled out the map and compass and tried to orient myself, but the terrain didn't quite match. I pressed on, figuring I'd reconnect with the trail loop eventually. The forest thickened, and the elevation got steeper. I kept thinking I'd spot a cairn or a blaze or something to confirm I was still en route, but nothing ever showed. By the time I set up camp that night near a dried-up creek, I had this tight feeling in my chest. I didn't want to admit I was lost, but something told me I was. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind was picking up. Trees creaked and groaned in the dark. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside the tent or something brushing against the nylon walls. My brain was playing tricks. I'd open my eyes, heart pounding, and just listen to the silence. I told myself it was animals, probably deer, maybe a fox. When the sun came up, I was exhausted but glad to see daylight. I packed up and hiked on, thinking if I could gain some elevation, I might see where I was. Around midday, I reached a ridge with a wide view across the valley below, but nothing looked familiar. No roads, no peaks I recognized from the map, just endless trees and ridges. Then it started to rain. It wasn't heavy at first, just a drizzle, but it was enough to soak my jacket and pants within an hour. The trail, if you could call it that, became slippery and muddy. I slipped twice going down a steep slope and twisted my ankle the second time. Not badly, but enough that it hurt when I put weight on it. That night, I found a flat spot beside a group of large rocks and pitched my tent in the rain. I was cold, wet, and trying not to panic. I boiled water for a meal, but couldn't eat much. I kept thinking about how quiet everything was. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet, like I'd stepped outside the rest of the world. The fourth day, I decided to follow the creek downhill. It was the only constant direction I had, and I figured it would eventually lead to a road or a campsite or at least a bigger body of water. I followed it for hours, weaving through brush and climbing over boulders. I was moving slower because of the ankle, and now my left knee had started aching too from compensating. By mid-afternoon, I found an old hunting blind, half collapsed and overgrown with moss. There were beer cans scattered around, and a couple rusted shell casings. Felt like it hadn't been used in years. I sat under the edge of its old roof to rest, trying to decide whether to camp there or keep moving. I kept going. That's when things got worse. As I was stepping down from a big rock, my foot slipped and I fell hard on my left side. I landed in some brush and hit my ribs against a smaller rock underneath. It knocked the wind out of me. I couldn't breathe for a second, just made these dry, heaving sounds. When I finally stood up, I realized something was wrong. I couldn't lift my left arm very high. My ribs felt like they were on fire. I wasn't crying, but I was close. The realization hit me. I was completely alone, deep in the woods, probably miles off trail, injured, and no one even knew exactly where I was. My phone was still useless, no bars, just a blinking battery icon. I built a fire that night, more for comfort than heat. I didn't even try to eat. I just sat there, in pain, watching the flames flicker. The firewood was wet and hissed smoke. I kept thinking I heard movement beyond the circle of light, but I never saw anything. Just the woods breathing around me. I barely slept. Every time I shifted, pain shot through my ribs. I was curled up like a question mark inside my sleeping bag, listening to the crackle of the fire dying slowly. The next morning, everything was damp. My clothes were sticking to me, and my feet were starting to blister inside my boots. I forced myself to keep walking, limping now. I was moving slow, but I figured if I didn't keep going, I might not leave these woods at all. Midday, I found a crude trail. I say crude because it looked like it had once been a real trail, but nature had mostly reclaimed it. Still, it went somewhere and I followed it. For hours, I started to feel like I was hallucinating. I'd see shapes in the trees, flashes of color, like tents or jackets, but they were just leaves or bark. Then I found something that snapped me out of it. A fence. It was old, barbed wire stretched across rotting wooden posts, running along the edge of a clearing. On the other side was a dirt road. A real road. I nearly laughed when I saw it. Felt like winning the lottery. I climbed over the fence, snagging my pants in the process, and limped toward the road. I didn't even know which way to go, but I picked left and started walking. An hour later, I saw the first sign of life I'd seen in nearly 5 days. A red pickup truck parked beside a small cabin. No one was outside, but the chimney was smoking. I knocked on the door, then collapsed on the porch. I woke up in a hospital bed later that night. The guy who lived in the cabin had driven me to the nearest town, Buena Vista, and dropped me at the ER. I had a cracked rib, mild dehydration, and a sprained ankle. The doctor said I was lucky, real lucky. The police came by and asked a few questions, and I told them the whole story. They didn't seem surprised. Apparently people get lost out there more than you'd think. Most of them make it out. Some don't. I stayed in a motel for a few days until I could walk without wincing. Then I flew back home. I never went on another solo hike after that. Even now, years later, I still think about those woods. Not in a mystical way, not like they were haunted or magical. Just real, raw, indifferent. A place that didn't care if I lived or died. I still love the outdoors, but now I go with friends. I bring a GPS. I check in. I triple check my route. Because out there, you don't get second chances. Not often. And I'm not sure I would have made it out if I hadn't seen that fence when I did. It was mid-July, and I had decided to take a solo hiking trip in the Adirondack Mountains. I was 28, in decent shape, and felt like I could handle a few days alone in the wilderness. I'd done plenty of hiking before, but always with others, and I figured it was time to push myself. I had everything packed in my backpack: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, my map, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. The kind of stuff that would get me through a couple of days of roughing it. The weather was perfect for a hike. Sunny but not too hot, with a breeze that made the heat tolerable. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. It was a popular spot for day hikers, but as I walked past the parking lot, The sound of the engine noise faded, and it felt like the world had shifted to something far quieter. A strange sort of peace settled in. The mountains loomed in the distance, massive and timeless, and the trail before me wound deeper into the forest. I'd planned to take a 2-day hike, staying in a small clearing I knew about, near a river. It wasn't far into the trail, but it was isolated enough to give me the experience I was looking for. The first couple of hours on the trail were beautiful, nothing but trees, the sounds of birds, and the occasional rustling of the leaves. My boots crunching against the dirt was the loudest sound. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. There were no other hikers. I'd heard people talking about how the trail gets less populated after a while, but I didn't expect it to be this quiet. I liked it, though. It was peaceful. It felt like I was becoming part of the wilderness, in a way. I had my map, but I didn't need it yet. The trail was clear and well-marked, with the occasional wooden sign to reassure me I was heading in the right direction. The sun hung high in the sky, filtering through the canopy in beams of light that flickered as the wind stirred the leaves. I was making good time. Around noon, I stopped at a small stream to refill my water bottle. The sound of the water flowing over the rocks was calming. I sat down on a nearby log, taking a moment to just breathe. The peace of it all made me feel comfortable, like nothing could go wrong. I felt confident, too, more than I should have looking back. It wasn't until later, as the sun started to dip lower, that things began to feel off. I reached the clearing by early evening. It was just as I remembered it, wide open with tall grass and a few rocks scattered around. The river ran nearby, a gentle trickle that sounded more like a whisper than anything loud. I set up camp near the edge of the clearing, where I knew I'd be able to keep an eye on the area. The sun was just about to set when I finished setting up my tent. The air had a coolness to it now, a reminder that the night would be here soon. I started to gather some wood for a fire, but then I noticed something odd. A rustling sound in the trees, far off in the distance. It wasn't the usual sound of the wind or an animal. It was almost like a movement that didn't belong. At first, I dismissed it. Could have been a deer or a bear. I'd heard them moving through the woods before. I continued with my fire building, but the feeling of unease settled deeper into my chest. Something was off. I finished the fire and sat down, eating a small meal as I stared into the flames. The shadows grew longer, the sun dipping completely behind the mountains. I'd only been sitting there for about 10 minutes when I heard it again. A soft, slow rustling from the trees. This time it was closer, too close. My eyes snapped toward the source of the noise. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. But the rustling continued, moving steadily closer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and stood up. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end now. My heart began to race. I shined the beam of the light into the trees, but there was no sign of anything moving. It was almost like the sound was coming from multiple directions at once, surrounding me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just an animal, maybe a few squirrels or something small making their way through the brush. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there for a long time listening. The rustling had stopped, but I still couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, watching me. My hand was gripping the flashlight tight enough that my knuckles were white. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. A figure maybe 30 yards away. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite an animal either. It was tall, standing upright like a person, but its outline was distorted, almost like it was flickering in the dim light. The trees partially obscured it, but I could make out the shape, a vague, shifting shadow that didn't quite fit with the landscape. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no explanation that made sense. I took a few cautious steps toward it, my flashlight beam following the shape. As I moved, the figure seemed to move too, drifting back into the shadows, as if it had seen me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the spot where it had been, but the fear I felt was overwhelming. I was starting to question everything I knew about the woods. My survival instincts kicked in, and I decided to get back to my tent. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what that thing was. I quickly grabbed my things, keeping the flashlight trained on the spot where the figure had been. The rustling started again, louder this time. It was all around me now, like the trees were whispering, closing in. By the time I reached the tent, I was almost panicked. I dove inside, zipping it up as fast as I could, and I crouched down, breathing heavily. The flashlight flickered in my hand, but I didn't care. I just needed to stay calm. The rustling continued for what felt like hours. I was trapped in the tent, alone in the dark, with no idea if what I had seen was real or just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something had been out there, something that didn't belong. I had always been the kind of person who loved the quiet of nature, the kind of peace that only a long hike up a mountain could bring. The sort of silence that's different from the quiet of a city or even a small town. It's a deep, almost suffocating silence. The kind that lets your mind wander but also makes you acutely aware of every little sound. The rustle of a leaf, the snap of a twig underfoot, the wind moving through the trees. There's a special kind of solitude when you're on a trail alone, and I thrived in it. It was late October, and the chill of early autumn had begun to set in. The days were still warm enough to make the hikes comfortable, but the nights had grown cold. The leaves on the trees were in the process of turning, their vibrant reds and yellows a sharp contrast to the stillness of the forest. I had taken a week off work for a solo hiking trip up in the Cascade Mountains, hoping to clear my head after a rough few months. Work had been stressful, and I'd recently ended a relationship that hadn't been healthy to begin with. So, I needed the time away to focus on myself. The trail I had chosen was one I had done before, just not in such late-season conditions. It was about a 30-mile stretch, going through dense forests, up rocky outcroppings, and into high alpine areas with sweeping views of the surrounding valleys. I had started at dawn, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as I made my way up the mountain. My pack was light, just the essentials. A sleeping bag, a tarp for shelter, some food and water, and my camera. The air was crisp, but not cold enough to freeze the moisture in the ground. The trail was clear and well-marked, the path winding through towering pine trees and bushes with the occasional break in the foliage that revealed distant views of the valleys below. As I walked deeper into the woods, I could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't that the weather had changed, at least not immediately, but there was something in the atmosphere, something intangible, that made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was just the solitude, or maybe it was the way the light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. I shook off the feeling, blaming it on my mind being preoccupied with thoughts of my life back home. I stopped for a quick break at a small clearing, taking in the view of the valley below. The air was cooler now, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. The sound of the wind whistling through the branches was the only noise, and the absence of anything else felt almost oppressive. After a few minutes, I decided it was time to press on. The trail would start to get steeper in the next section, and I didn't want to be caught out after dark. As I continued up the mountain, the trail narrowed, and the trees became denser. The sound of the wind was blocked by the thick canopy above, and I was left with only the occasional birdsong or the distant rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. It was getting late in the afternoon, and the sun had sunk lower in the sky. I had hoped to make it to the campsite before nightfall, but that was beginning to look like a long shot. Around 5 p.m., I reached a fork in the trail. One path led to a higher, more exposed area with better views, while the other continued through the dense forest and was the main route to the campsite. I took the higher trail, eager for the views before it got too dark. The further I climbed, the more the temperature dropped. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, the wind had picked up, and the air was biting. I pulled my hat down tighter over my head and tried to ignore the chill creeping into my bones. The view from the top was breathtaking. The valley stretched out before me, the last golden rays of the sun illuminating the hills in the distance. It was a moment of pure serenity, the kind of beauty that makes everything else seem distant and insignificant. I pulled out my camera and snapped a few pictures, taking a deep breath and letting the wind fill my lungs. It felt good to be here, far from the chaos of my everyday life. But then, just as I was about to turn around and head back down, I heard something. A sound, no, it was a movement, a rustling in the brush behind me. I froze, listening carefully. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal, at least not one I could identify. It was deliberate, slow, almost cautious. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The forest was quiet again, except for the wind. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably a deer or a squirrel, just an animal moving through the brush. But deep down, something felt off. I stood there for a few more minutes, staring into the darkening trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a sense of unease settled over me. I should have gone back to the main trail right then, but something in me told me to push on, to get to the campsite, to find a place to shelter for the night. I headed back down the trail, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the rustling behind me seemed to follow my every step. It wasn't constant, but I could hear it intermittently. Something moving through the brush, always just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that I was just tired and stressed from the hike, but the sensation only grew stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature continued to drop. The trail was now a dim shadow beneath the canopy, the light fading fast. I had to make it to the campsite soon, or I'd be stuck in the woods overnight with no shelter. My pace quickened, but so did the sounds behind me. The rustling was louder now, closer. It was as if whatever it was following me. I turned a corner, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A dark shape, just out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat. The rustling had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I was almost to the campsite, I thought, just a little further. But as I reached a small creek, I heard something unmistakable. A twig snapping underfoot. Not a large one, but enough to make my heart race. I looked around, but the forest was empty. There was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Whoever or whatever was out there, I was sure now that they were watching me. The quiet was deafening. The wind still, the world holding its breath. I felt like I was in a trap, exposed, vulnerable. I needed to make it to shelter before dark fully set in. I picked up my pace, nearly jogging now, the sound of my footsteps loud in the stillness. I could hear the faint rustling again, just behind me. I didn't dare look back anymore. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another hiker, lost like me? Or was it something worse? Someone who had been watching me from the moment I entered the woods? I rounded a bend, and there it was, the campsite. A small clearing with a fire pit and a weathered wooden sign marking it as a designated spot. My heart thudded in my chest with relief. I made my way to the fire pit, setting down my pack and trying to steady my breathing. But the feeling didn't go away. It was as if the air itself was thick with tension. I set up my tarp, quickly arranging it into a makeshift shelter. The wind had picked up again, and the temperature had dropped further, the cold seeping into my skin. The firewood I had packed was dry, and I quickly started a small fire, watching the flames flicker to life. As I sat by the fire, I tried to push the uneasy feeling from my mind. I told myself it was just the solitude, the isolation of being out here alone. But every crack of the fire, every gust of wind, made me jump. The rustling sound from earlier hadn't gone away completely. It was just softer now, more distant, like it was waiting. The night stretched on, and I stayed by the fire, refusing to let it die out. I didn't want to be left in the dark, alone in the cold. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep, my dreams filled with shadowy figures moving through the trees. When I woke, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The air was still, the forest calm. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only ash in the pit. I packed up quickly, not wanting to linger any longer than necessary. The hike back down the mountain felt different, less oppressive, but still heavy with the feeling of something unresolved. I made it back to my car without any further incident, but the sense of being watched lingered long after I had left the trail behind. I had come for peace and solitude, but I left with a sense of unease I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the mountain that had scared me. It was something deeper, something human. The woods had reminded me that nature wasn't just a place of beauty and calm. It was a place where you could easily be lost, and not all who get lost find their way back. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon when I decided to start my hike. The temperature was cool, the air crisp, and the trail ahead of me was quiet, just how I liked it. I had driven out to the Cascades in Washington, away from the busy city. The plan was simple: hike a well-known trail that led to a secluded lake. I didn't know why I found myself drawn to this, but something about being out here, in the quiet, away from everything, felt right. I was in my mid-30s, old enough to be cautious but young enough to still have a sense of adventure. My backpack was packed with the usual gear: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a headlamp. Nothing too fancy, but enough to make sure I was prepared if something went wrong. The trail started off easy, a clear path through towering pines. The ground was covered with pine needles, soft and springy underfoot. The forest smelled like damp earth and wood, and every so often, I would catch the scent of something faintly floral, like wildflowers growing at the edge of the trees. I was alone, of course. Hiking alone was something I did often. Some people didn't get it, being out here by yourself, but for me it was peaceful. No one else to slow you down, no one else to hold you back. The trail was about 8 miles one way, and I planned to take my time and camp by the lake for the night before heading back in the morning. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the sounds of the world seemed to fade away. The noise of civilization was replaced by the rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird or the scurrying of a small animal through the underbrush. The trail started to incline gently as I climbed higher, following the narrow path that snaked through the forest. It wasn't until I had been hiking for about 2 hours that I started to feel the weight of the hike setting in. I was carrying a decent load, and while the trail was relatively clear, there were moments where I had to step carefully over exposed roots or small rocks that jutted out from the path. The further I went, the more isolated the surroundings became. There were no other hikers, no signs of anyone else. Felt like I had the forest all to myself. I reached a small clearing about halfway to the lake, a good spot to stop for a break. I pulled off my backpack, set it on the ground, and sat on a rock to rest. The view from the clearing was beautiful, an expanse of forest stretching out as far as the eye could see. There was something calming about it, yet something a little unsettling too. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Shaking off the thought, I took a swig of water and ate a handful of trail mix. I had no idea why I felt this way, it was just the quiet. The forest was so still, so untouched, that it felt almost too perfect, like it was hiding something. I checked my map again. According to it, the lake was only a few more miles ahead. I finished my snack, packed up, and started walking again. The trail was starting to get steeper, and with every step, I could feel the effort in my legs. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the trail. I started to pick up my pace, eager to reach the lake before it got too dark. The light faded fast as I moved forward, and before I knew it, the sun had set completely. The sky was turning a deep purple, and the first stars began to appear. I switched on my headlamp, the narrow beam of light cutting through the dark forest ahead of me. The trail was now harder to follow, and I found myself relying more on the map and my instincts. Then, just as I was rounding a sharp bend in the trail, I heard it. A noise, faint at first, but distinct. It sounded like footsteps. I froze. My heart rate picked up, and I strained my ears. It was definitely footsteps, rhythmic and steady, coming from behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. The forest was still, save for the wind whispering through the trees. Maybe it was just another hiker, I thought, but why hadn't I seen them? The trail wasn't wide, and I would have noticed if someone was behind me. I quickened my pace, feeling a nervous tension building in my chest. The footsteps continued, never speeding up or slowing down, just there, echoing softly through the trees. I could feel my breath coming faster, but I refused to look back. The path was narrow, and I had no intention of stopping in this remote part of the forest, in the dark, with someone following me. As I pressed on, the sound of footsteps seemed to grow louder, closer, until it was almost impossible to ignore. My mind raced, trying to figure out who could be out here and why they hadn't made their presence known. But there was no logical explanation. No one had passed me on the trail, and the thought of being followed by someone in the middle of nowhere was more than unsettling. Suddenly, the trail took a sharp turn and opened up into a rocky area. The sound of the footsteps stopped, and I felt an immediate sense of relief, but it didn't last long. As I rounded the corner, I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the path ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was just standing there, unmoving, in the middle of the trail. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by shadows. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then the man shifted slightly, just enough to make it clear he had noticed me. He didn't speak, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and calculating. A knot formed in my stomach, and I tried to remember the basic self-defense techniques I had learned over the years. But nothing came to mind. All I could think of was getting away. The man didn't take a step closer, but I could tell he wasn't leaving either. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The air between us was thick with tension. After what felt like an eternity, the man slowly turned around and started walking away. I watched him for a moment, still unsure if I should move. He didn't look back, just kept walking, slowly disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I waited for several more minutes, my body frozen with adrenaline. When I was sure he was gone, I turned and kept walking, faster now, as if the faster I moved, the safer I would be. My mind was a mess of confusion and fear. Who was that? Why had he been out here in the dark, in the middle of nowhere? I didn't stop again. I just kept going, driven by the need to get to the lake, to find the comfort of water, of being somewhere familiar. The trail flattened out again, and I kept moving. Finally, after what felt like forever, I reached the lake. The water was calm, the surface reflecting the starlit sky above. The sight of it brought a wave of relief, and I set up camp quickly. I didn't care about making a fire or anything fancy. I just wanted to be still, to sit and breathe. As I sat by the water, I tried to calm my mind. The man, the footsteps, the eerie stillness. It all felt so surreal, like it wasn't even real. But I was here now, and I wasn't going to let fear take over. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and tried to sleep. The night passed uneventfully. I woke up at dawn, feeling a strange sense of peace, as if the night's events were nothing but a bad dream. I packed up my gear and started the hike back down the trail, every step lighter than the last. As I made my way back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. The man, the footsteps, the way everything had seemed so still, so quiet. It was all too much to ignore. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, I never could. When I got back to my car, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. I had made it through the night, safe, and sometimes that was all that mattered. As I drove away, leaving the woods behind me, I couldn't help but feel thankful for the experience, for the reminder that even in the quietest moments, there's always something lurking just beyond the trees. It was late autumn, sometime in October. The air had that crisp, chilly feel to it that made me pull my jacket tighter around my body as I hiked along the narrow trail. I had planned this trip months in advance, an escape from the usual grind of work and life, something to clear my head. I wanted solitude, quiet, just me, the forest, and the sound of my boots crunching against the fallen leaves. I had no idea just how much that solitude would start to weigh on me, or how unnerving the quiet could be, until I found myself deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization. I was 31, living in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, and I'd always loved being out in nature. Hiking was something I had done on occasion, but never something serious. The mountains weren't exactly forgiving, and I knew this trail would take me about 5 days to complete if I paced myself right. The destination was a cabin, an old log cabin built back in the 1800s that had been left unused for years. The thought of staying there, surrounded by miles of wilderness, felt like the perfect escape. I started my hike early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise as I loaded up my backpack and set off. The first couple of miles were easy, with the trail weaving gently through a dense forest. The trees were tall and thick, with their branches reaching high above to form a canopy that blocked out much of the early light. The smell of damp wood and pine filled the air, a scent I had come to associate with peace and adventure. Birds called from the treetops, and the ground was covered with a blanket of amber leaves. But as I pushed deeper into the woods, things began to change. The trail, which had been well marked at the start, soon became less clear. The path narrowed, twisting in ways that didn't feel entirely natural. I found myself having to pay closer attention to my surroundings, making sure I didn't stray off the path or lose my way. I didn't mind, though. It added to the sense of isolation, the sense that I was truly out there, far from the hustle of everyday life. By the end of the first day, I had made good progress, setting up camp at a small clearing near a creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and I quickly got a fire going before settling in to cook a simple dinner. There was something comforting about being in the wilderness, even if the nightfall brought with it an unsettling silence. It wasn't the kind of silence I was used to in the city, where you could always hear traffic or the hum of a distant streetlight. No, this was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept racing, distracted by the noises of the night. The occasional rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the call of an owl in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I would catch myself straining to listen, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. But nothing did. It was almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The next day, I pressed on, determined to reach the cabin by nightfall. The trail became steeper, the air thinner, and the trees more spaced out. By midday, the weather had started to change, and clouds gathered overhead, blocking out the sun. The forecast had warned of a storm coming in, but I hadn't expected it to arrive so quickly. I made a note to keep moving faster to avoid getting caught in the rain. I knew the cabin wasn't far, just a few more miles up the ridge, but something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The quiet, for one, was deeper than usual, like everything in the forest had gone still. Even the birds had stopped singing. The wind, which had been gentle earlier, had died down to nothing. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, climbing higher up the trail. The storm had begun to roll in, and the first drops of rain hit my jacket. I could feel the temperature drop, the chill creeping into my bones as the clouds darkened overhead. Hours passed, and I began to wonder if I had missed a turn somewhere. The trail was becoming less defined, the earth softer underfoot, the trees growing more erratic and twisted. It was starting to feel like I was walking through a different world, one that I wasn't entirely sure I belonged to. The wind picked up again, though it felt unnatural, colder and sharper than it had been earlier in the day. The trees groaned as they swayed, and the storm clouds overhead began to swirl with a strange energy. I checked my map and compass again. I was still on track, or at least I thought I was. The cabin should have been just around the next bend, but when I reached it, all I saw was more wilderness. The trail had disappeared, leaving me in a dense thicket of underbrush and tangled trees. My heart rate quickened, my mind racing. This wasn't right. I knew this wasn't the way. I turned around, thinking maybe I had taken a wrong turn, but all I saw were trees, and more trees. The path had vanished entirely. I looked at my compass, but it was spinning wildly, the needle unable to settle in any direction. Panic crept in, and for the first time on this trip, I felt truly lost. I didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? I had no idea. The storm had fully broken now, rain coming down in sheets, the wind howling through the branches. I took shelter beneath a large tree, huddling against its trunk for some semblance of protection. My clothes were soaked through, and my hands were numb from the cold. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I could figure this out. I had a map, a compass, and I knew the general direction I needed to go. But as the rain pounded harder and the darkness crept in, the sense of isolation became unbearable. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the fading light. I couldn't hear anything but the storm now. No birds, no animals, just the relentless sound of the wind and rain. It was as if the entire forest was conspiring to keep me there, lost, alone. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every noise in the dark, every crack of the trees, sent my heart racing. The forest felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the weight of something else, something deeper, that I couldn't shake. But by morning, something had changed. The storm had passed, and the sky had cleared. The air was fresh, the forest now filled with the scent of wet earth and pine. For the first time in what felt like ages, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I was still lost, but something about the clear morning light gave me hope. I set off again, more determined than ever. The forest was quiet now, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. The path was faint, almost non-existent, but I followed it as best as I could, trying to focus on moving forward. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something. A break in the trees, a rock formation that seemed familiar. I was getting closer. I could feel it. After hours of hiking, when my body was aching from the effort, I saw it. There, in the distance, a small cabin nestled against the ridge, just as I had imagined it. My heart leapt in my chest. I wasn't lost anymore. The cabin was old, weathered, its logs darkened with age. The door hung slightly ajar, and I could see the faint glow of sunlight filtering through the small windows. I walked up to it, my legs shaking from exhaustion. My hands fumbled for the door, and I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was empty, quiet. The air smelled musty, and the floor creaked beneath my boots. But there, in the corner, was a fireplace. I immediately set to work, gathering wood from outside and building a fire. The warmth of the flames was like a balm to my cold, tired body. I sat down on the old wooden chair, letting out a sigh of relief. I had made it. Against all odds, I had found the cabin, and in that moment, everything felt okay again. As the fire crackled, I reflected on the journey, on the fear, the uncertainty, and the overwhelming sense of being alone in the wild. But I had survived. I had found my way back, and now, as I sat there in the warmth, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was almost indescribable. And in the end, that was the feeling that stayed with me. The knowledge that, despite everything, I had made it out. I had faced the wilderness and come out stronger for it. The isolation, the fear, the silence, none of it had broken me. I had found my way. The air was crisp as I stood at the trailhead of the Mount Elbow Trail, a place I had seen in a few pictures online but had never truly experienced. The sky was overcast, with clouds hanging low over the distant ridges, as though the world was pressing down on me. I didn't mind the clouds. I preferred the cold over the sweltering heat of summer. It felt like a perfect day for a hike. My backpack was light, filled only with the essentials: water, a few snacks, my map, a small first aid kit, and my camera. It was a simple enough plan. Hike the mountain trail, take some photos, and return before dusk. I was alone by choice, of course. There's something about the solitude of hiking alone that appeals to me. I love the silence, the calm, the sense of being entirely on my own in the wilderness. There's no chatter, no interruptions, just the steady crunch of your boots against the trail and the occasional chirp of a bird in the trees. I started the hike at around 10 a.m. The first few miles of the trail were relatively easy. The path was well marked, a wide trail with soft dirt and a few rocks scattered here and there. The The trees on either side towered above me, their trunks thick and gnarled. Every now and then, the sun peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils, and I couldn't help but smile to myself. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. As I ascended, the landscape began to change. The trees became thinner and the air grew cooler. The trail became steeper, winding around rocks and large boulders. By noon, I was at the halfway point, a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I paused for a moment to drink some water, taking in the view of the distant town, barely visible through the haze. I could hear the faint sound of a stream somewhere below, but it was quiet up here, almost eerily so. I checked my map. The next section of the trail would be a bit more challenging, but I was confident. I'd hiked plenty of trails before, some far more difficult than this one. This was supposed to be a day trip, a simple test of endurance and maybe a bit of peace. Nothing too strenuous. The further I went, the more rugged the terrain became. The trail narrowed, and the rocks grew larger and more frequent. I had to step carefully now, balancing on uneven surfaces, clutching at tree roots to steady myself. The forest had become denser, the trees closer together, their branches intertwining above me. The light dimmed as the canopy thickened, and a cold wind began to blow, rustling the leaves. The once pleasant chirping of birds had fallen silent, replaced by the occasional crack of a branch or the scurry of small animals in the underbrush. It was around 2 p.m. when I reached the point where the trail split. According to the map, the main path continued to the left, leading to the summit. The other path, which veered off to the right, was marked as a shortcut down to a different trailhead. It wasn't on my planned route, but the idea of cutting the hike short and getting back to my car earlier appealed to me. I debated for a moment. The shortcut seemed faster, but it also looked less traveled, more wild. My instinct told me it might be risky, but I shrugged it off. I'd be fine. I took the right turn. The morning was crisp, cool, with just a hint of warmth sneaking through the trees. The trail was silent, and the forest was still waking up. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks. I wasn't a seasoned outdoorsman, but I had done enough weekend hikes to feel confident. The plan was simple: a solo day hike up into the mountains, through dense woods, to a summit that promised a spectacular view. The year was 2023, and I was 28 years old. I had packed a light backpack with the essentials: water, snacks, first aid kit, a map, and a flashlight just in case. My phone was in my pocket, though I wasn't expecting to need it. This hike was supposed to be a break from everything: work, social obligations, just life in general. It was my chance to get some solitude and clear my head. The trailhead was at the edge of a small parking lot. A few cars were already there when I arrived, mostly other hikers and a couple of mountain bikers. The sign said Blue Ridge Trail, and it had an elevation gain of about 3,500 feet over 8 miles. Not too tough, but enough to challenge me. The sun was still low in the sky as I adjusted my pack, took a deep breath, and set off into the woods. The first mile was easy. The trail was wide, well marked, and the forest felt peaceful. Pine trees towered over me, their needles soft and welcoming. The smell of earth and wood filled my senses, calming my mind with each step. Birds chirped overhead, and once in a while, a squirrel or a deer would dart through the underbrush. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trail started to narrow. The trees became denser, and the ground more uneven. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. I took my time, carefully navigating the rocks and roots that tripped me up. Sweat started to bead on my forehead, though it wasn't too hot yet. The quiet was almost too much at times, and I found myself thinking about everything: work, family, things I hadn't thought about in ages. By the time I reached the 3-mile mark, the trail had started to get steeper. The trees were thinner now, and the sound of running water echoed in the distance. The trail had turned into more of a rocky incline, and I had to use my hands a few times to steady myself. I was feeling the burn in my legs, but I welcomed it. The effort was grounding, making me feel connected to the landscape in a way I hadn't expected. At around the 4-mile mark, the trail split. There were no signs, just a faint path veering off to the right. I paused for a moment, pulling out my map. I had studied the trail before setting off, but this fork wasn't marked. A part of me wanted to turn around and stick to the main path, but another part, the curious part, felt drawn to the unknown path. It looked narrow, overgrown, and barely used. I thought about how it might be quieter, more secluded. After a brief moment of hesitation, I decided to take it. I figured I could always turn back if it seemed too risky. The further I went, the less the trail resembled anything I recognized. It was a lot more rugged, loose rocks, thick roots, and patches of mud. The trees were much older here, their trunks thick with age and the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. It was silent. No birds, no animals. The world felt still, like time had slowed down. As I pushed forward, the path became harder to follow. At some points, I had to crouch low to squeeze through narrow gaps between the trees. The air was heavier now, thick with moisture from the shade. It didn't take long for me to realize that I was deep into a part of the forest that didn't look like the well-traveled area I had started in. The trail had almost disappeared, swallowed up by the forest floor. I was no longer on a marked path. The feeling of being lost started to creep in, but I brushed it aside. I'd come this far. I wasn't going to turn around now. Around the 5-mile mark, the forest seemed to shift. The trees, while still large, began to lean in closer, and the ground grew uneven. It wasn't until I saw the first sign of something unusual that I really started to feel uneasy. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, a large, dark mass that looked like it had fallen from one of the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a large log, lying across the path, but something about it wasn't right. It wasn't just a fallen tree. The way it was positioned seemed unnatural, almost deliberate. I approached cautiously, my instincts telling me to stop. As I circled around it, I saw something strange. Scratches along the bark. Long, deep gouges that looked fresh, as if something had tried to claw its way through the wood. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a bear, or at least I didn't think so. Bears didn't leave scratches like that. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out here recently. Something I wasn't supposed to encounter. I hesitated. The path ahead was still unclear, and the weight of the forest pressed in on me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of curiosity. I wanted to know what lay beyond, so I pushed forward. For the next mile, the trail became less and less distinguishable. I was forcing my way through thick brush, stepping over fallen logs, and ducking under low-hanging branches. The trees were so densely packed now that it felt like I was in a completely different world, and the silence was deafening. Then I heard it, a sound soft but unmistakable, a snap of a twig. It was faint, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath. My eyes scanned the trees, the underbrush. There was nothing, just shadows, just the darkened forest around me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, but the unease lingered. I glanced at my phone, but there was no service. The signal had been gone for a while, but now it felt like it was even more isolating. Alone, deep in the woods with no one around. I pressed on, though. I didn't know why, but something inside me pushed me forward. I had come so far, and the summit wasn't far now. I could make it, but the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the landscape became more foreboding. I started to notice signs of something human-like, maybe scraps of fabric caught on branches, faint footprints in the mud, though they were so old that I couldn't tell how long they'd been there. Still, they made me uneasy. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something that truly shook me to my core. A small, abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, the remnants of a tent torn up and abandoned. I felt an icy chill spread through me. The gear was old, worn out, but it had been left in a hurry. The wind rustled the trees above, and I felt a sense of panic building up in my chest. Something wasn't right. Someone had been here recently. Someone had been here, and then they were gone. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't linger in the unsettling quiet. I had to leave, and I had to leave fast. I turned around, my mind racing, my heart thumping in my chest. But as I retraced my steps, I felt the weight of the forest bearing down on me. The trees seemed to lean in closer, blocking out the light. The trail was harder to follow now, more of a suggestion than an actual path. I stumbled, my foot slipping on loose rocks, and I almost lost my balance. The feeling of being watched pressed on me more intensely. I didn't know how long I had been walking. The hours seemed to drag on, the sun moving slowly through the sky as I pushed myself harder, faster. Eventually, I stumbled upon the main trail again, the familiar, well-maintained path that led back to the trailhead. I nearly collapsed in relief. The hike back down was quieter, faster. My legs burned from the effort, but the weight of the forest, the oppressive silence, was lifting. The daylight was fading, and as I neared the parking lot, I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I had made it, but the experience haunted me. The abandoned campsite, the strange markings on the trees, the feeling of being watched. I don't know what I encountered out there, but I know I won't be returning to those woods anytime soon.